Chapter 5 Tristan needed a way-in. The Infanzones had claimed a corner of the hold and were entertaining the sole foreigner they decided was worth their time, mere feet away but far beyond his reach. The thief did have to admit the Milani they'd picked was a fearsome specimen, with 2 inches of height on him and a build hinting she could handle that saber she was dragging around. Unlike the noblewoman, he was unlikely to get invited for refreshments, however, so he'd have to find another angle. Fortunately, one was there for the taking. The Infanzones had brought attendants with them. 6 people in all, and one would be his key. The soldiers, as soldiers did, went to dice the moment their masters ceased paying attention. Even the grim-faced Milani huntsman in Vilazar's service went, joining a tall man in Ruesna colors and a man Tristan would kill before this was all over, Cosmiflor, thrice accursed, and may the fucking devils of pandemonium eat him whole. There had already been a game going near the massive crates in the back of the hold, so after the soldiers joined, Tristan simply did the same. The welcome was lukewarm until he flashed some coppers, which were in short supply. Most were playing for buttons or trinkets. "We are playing Augur," a dark-haired woman enthusiastically told him. "No matches, Sacramonte rules." "Which are nonsense," a scarred Milani complained. "Why would the lover's stars make you lose?" Considering most the circle was Sacramontans, she won herself a few unfriendly stares with that. "We call them the Rat King's eyes," Cosm smiled, stroking his beard. "He is not a god whose attentions are kind." Tristan smirked. It was an old legend that the Rat King had been but a pack of rats, once, but that they had devoured one of the Manes, those great pristine gods so beloved of the Infanzones, and become a deity even those old things feared. There were 1,000 gods worshipped and bargained with in the mud of the murk, but few as beloved as the Rat King. He was as a patron to the lost and beggared, those who dwelled in shadow and filth. Not the kind of god that would look well upon the likes of Cosmiflor. "It's the usual way," the same dark-haired woman insisted. "Play or leave." The grizzled Milani sighed but picked up the dice, dropping them in a wooden cup before shaking it. Tristan had played Augur before. It was the simplest of dicing games, and so he was not afraid of losing too badly. He was not here to win anyhow. Betting low, he made sure to stay in the game as the dicers began to chat. The pushy dark-haired one who'd lit up at the sight of his coppers was called Ains, and now he recognized her from earlier. She was the woman married to the dust addict. Said man was napping, which spared him the sight of his wife losing badly at Augur. Gods, but Tristan had never seen someone so genuinely terrible at a game of chance. He was grateful for it, as her emptying pile of buttons loosened tongues. Winning always put folk in a fine mood. Information slowly trickled in. The huntsman come with the Vilazar was named Sonali, though he spoke little save when the other Milani addressed him in some foreign tongue. Tristan knew a little Amoya, but whatever they spoke only seemed to have so much in common with the best-known tongue out of the Isles. Inyoni, the older woman with the scars who'd complained about the rules earlier, was a great deal chattier in everyone's shared Antigua. The thief asked casually about the other 2 Milani she'd come with earlier in the day, soon surprised at easily getting an answer he'd figured he would have to finesse out. "The boy's my nephew," Inyoni said. "I'm coming along to keep an eye on him." "Family is the most important thing," Ains agreed. The man in Ruesta colors rolled his eyes at them. This one was called Ricardo, and though he was not as large as the Aslan Legbreaker, it was a close thing. Closely shaved, he had the kind of well-proportioned face that Tristan knew was considered handsome. He was also, to put it in a single word, a shit. "Women's talk," Ricardo mocked before pushing a copper on a bet below 4. Ains bet 2 buttons on above 9, solid odds she had somehow already lost thrice on. "There's no need for rudeness," Cosm drawled, pushing his own bet on 8 precise. He liked to look like a good man, Cosmiflor. Tristan had been young, but he remembered that much. The others on the list had been demanding, often rude, but Cosm had always been kind with his father. Told him with a smile that it would be over soon, that he just needed to get through it. He'd still had that same smile on his face when pulling the trigger. The thief's gaze must have lingered, for the bearded man glanced at him curiously. There was not a speck of recognition on the Cosm's face, Not that he had expected one. He'd been but a child when they last met. Tristan smiled, burying his hatred deep. "What is it like, working for Infanzones?" the thief asked, feigning fascination. Cosm did not hide his smugness. "Exhausting, but rewarding in its own way," he claimed. "Though in truth I serve not the brothers but one of their uncles, so they must listen to me in all things." Tristan doubted that very much but nodded as if admiring. Ricardo, who'd been listening to them, laughed. "The perks are shit when working for the Churden," the big man said. "Now me? I get to look over Lady Isabel and her pretty little maids. There's a real prize." It was not the first time tonight he mentioned the maids, which he seemed to be laying claim on to an entirely disinterested audience. The huntsman silently eyed the other man, then muttered something to the other Mulaney. Tristan smothered a smile when he recognized the words in Amoya, which translated to something like crow meat. A grinning Indian, he rolled the dice, a 3 and 5. Ains cursed disbelievingly, Cosm smirking as he claimed the pot. Ricardo looked none too pleased at having lost, his coppers thinning. "We ought to get the valet in there," the big man said. "Go get him, Cosm. Gascon attending to the brothers is why I can sit here in peace," the bearded man replied, shaking his head. "Besides, he is not as bad with money as you think." And like that, Tristan had what he wanted, names and faces for all 6 attendants. Ricardo seemed like the kind of man that would be easy to get talking when plied with liquor and flattery, but entirely too unreliable to be used. Neither Sonali nor Cosm could be his key either. The Mulaney was quiet and distant, while Tristan was not sure how well he'd be able to hide his hatred if he spent too long around the other man. That left the personal servants. Since the Churden valet was even now polishing the boots of the brothers, Tristan's gaze moved to the Ruesta handmaids. It'd have to be one of them. Now he just needed to get rid of one last problem. "4 dices on below 5, Fortuna demanded in his ear, draped over his shoulder. "This one's a win, I can feel it in my bones." Tristan grimaced. He could not risk even a whisper, not so close to so many people. Irksome when he was itching to point that she did not, in fact, have bones. "Come on," Fortuna insisted. "When have I ever steered you wrong?" Every single time he had gambled, he silently replied. He put 2 coppers on 6 exact instead. "Wait, no, you're right," she muttered. "This is better. All in, Tristan. Bet everything." Fortuna, as befitting of the Lady of Long Odds, only had 2 stratagems and games of chance, doubling down or going all in. He ignored her, which proved warranted when a moment later 2 5s were rolled and he lost his coppers. He then used the loss as a pretext for retreat, forcing himself to ignore Fortuna's indignant howling. "We had them, Tristan," the goddess bellowed. "Our luck was turning around, I'm sure of it. We just needed to keep it a little longer." Abuela had taught him that gods always craved something. It was in their nature, they were either given face through mankind's touch, leaving them with hungers that they could only satisfy through men. It was what gods got from contracts, a way to sate those hungers, and the same reason that if he listened to Fortuna he would bet on bad dice until he was destitute. It was that 1 in 100,000 victory she craved, the long odds come true. To her, losing 1,000 times for that single unlikely win would be nothing more than suffering through overcooked greens to get at a juicy side of pork. "We'll try again later," Tristan murmured, pretending to be brushing his knee so he could hide his mouth. "You always say that," Fortuna pouted, "but then we never do." She was pouting, so the storm had passed. She'd stay snippy about it for a bit, then before the turn of the hour entirely forget. With that scene too, he turned his attention back to the handmaids. Both were near their mistress, who was playing at court with the other nobles and ignoring them so long as she did not need anything fetched. One, a short dark-haired woman whose name he had learned was Beatrice, was finishing up mending a coat with needle and thread. The other, a redhead whose name was Brisida, information obtained through Ricardo's boasting he would get her in bed, was paging through a book with a bored look. Tristan got closer but not enough to earn more than an indifferent glance from either, waiting for an opportunity. It came when Beatrice began to put away her needle in a neat box, a sight he answered by immediately borrowing luck. The ticking began in the back of his mind, a clock's moving gears, and a heartbeat later the box slipped through the maid's hands. Needles and threads spilled all over the floor, the woman letting out a horrified gasp, and even as he rose to help her, Tristan released the lock he'd borrowed. Fortune snapped back, likely so for the lightness of what he'd taken, but it returned with unerring aim. A wooden bobbin rolled under his foot and he slipped with a startled yelp, falling forward. Tristan landed on his knees, only a hand keeping his face off the bottom of the hold, and did his best to ignore Fortuna's hysterical laughter. "Sweet mayonnaise, are you all right?" Sighing, the thief looked up at Beatrice's face. She was trying to hide her amusement but failing, and dragged himself back up. "Nothing was wounded save my pride," he wryly replied. "Would you like a hint?" "That is kind of you to offer," the maid said, sounding surprised. "It would be appreciated." The threads had rolled away in every direction and needles were hard to pick out in the gloom of the hold, so it was genuine work to get them back. The other maid ignored him as they scuttled about, at first, until finally she closed her book with a loud sigh and got up. Brushing back red curls, she bent and picked up a single bobbin of blue thread as Beatrice was reaching out for it. It was dropped into the box almost contemptuously before Brasida turned a sneer on the both of them. "Careful the vagrant doesn't pocket some of Lady Isabel's things, Beatrice," the redhead said, then her lips quirked cruelly. "Though maybe he'll cut you in so you can finally afford a decent dress." "I'll take responsibility if there is a mishap, Brasida," Beatrice curtly replied. "Drop things less, then," Brasida advised. "Your breeding is showing." And on that parting shot she flounced away, leaving dark-haired Beatrice struggling not look furious. It passed after a moment and the maid turned an apologetic look on the thief. "I'm sorry," she said. "What for?" Tristan snorted. "She seems a horrid bitch." A gamble, but he liked his odds. Beatrice's mouth closed but she was not quite able to silence the laugh startling its way out of her throat. Under Tristan's smiling gaze the maid convulsed a few times, then erupted into giggles. "She really is," Beatrice admitted. "You'd think she were a king's daughter instead of a drapier's." Ah, Tristan thought. So it was like that. Drapiers were wealthy men, and the pressing reason one's daughter would be serving as handmaid to a lady was so she might use that foothold in noble circles to marry up. Meaning Brasida was a maid only until she found better, while Beatrice would be a servant for life. Their status, and treatment, would be starkly different. Good for him, though. An enemy, especially a common one, would make it easier to forge ties. "My sympathies," the thief told her, finding he meant it. The dark-eyed maid looked up at him for a moment, then hummed. Bringing her hand to the side of her dress as if to straighten it, she discreetly curled her fore and middle fingers. The thief hid his surprise at the sight of the mark of the rat being made, pretending to scratch at his sideburns while returning it. Beatrice smiled. "Had a feeling you might be," she said. "Born in Feria," he told her. Feria district was of the nicer parts of the Merc. He had not stayed there. Without his father, there had been no affording the rent set by the Cherdon, but telling Beatrice he'd cut his teeth in rougher places like Arturo and Kairar would do him no favors. The dark-haired maid's smile grew more genuine. "I am as well," she told him. "The North End, near Arturo. East from me, around Weepers Avenue," he shared. She looked impressed, though she should not have been. Before they tied it up, he clarified. These last few years the noble house of Cherdon had cleaned up some of the many streets they owned in Feria. Mostly so they could raise the rents, throwing out the old tenants and replacing them with wealthier migrants that couldn't find rooms in the ever-overcrowded quays. A lucrative racket, by all reports. "Figures," Beatrice dryly said, eyeing him up and down. He grinned back. Tristan was cleaner than most, for a dirty thief would not be allowed into anywhere worth robbing, but he still had filth under his fingernails. He had not bathed in a few days even if his clothes were clean. Not so for the maid, who even smelled faintly of lilac. Before he could tease her about that, an interruption bowled him over. Lady Isabel Ruesto was barely taller than Beatrice and just as dark-haired, but she was hard to mistake for the other. The Infanzon had an indolence about her particular to those that had never done a day's work in their life. "It was lovely of you to help Beatrice," the Ruesta told him, smiling and laying a hand on his wrist. "May I have your name, sir?" It was an effort not to allow distaste to show on his face. "Tristan," the thief smiled back. "It is my honor to meet you, Lady Ruesta." The Infanzon tittered. "Call me Lady Isabel," she insisted. "It is the least I can do for someone who so gallantly helped my maid." She shot Beatrice a look of condescending fondness. "She is not usually so clumsy, I swear to you." Beatrice bent her head before her mistress, murmuring apologies that were airily dismissed. Practice kept Tristan's smile from growing visibly stiff. "It must be the ship," the thief said. "Journeys have their difficulties." The noble brat nodded. "Too true," she said, smile brightening. "Yet they are so very exciting." She patted his arm again. "I do hope to see more of you, Tristan," the Ruesta said. "We shall talk again." She flounced off as suddenly as she had flounced in, returning to her nest of nobles. The gray-eyed thief waited until she was settled to turn to Beatrice and roll his eyes. "Would it be rude," he said, "to offer my sympathies twice?" The dark-haired maid blinked, then turned an intense gaze on him. "No," she slowly said. "But you mean?" Beatrice hesitated. "Did you not find her charming?" "The opposite," Tristan frankly replied. Beatrice's face twisted in surprise, to his own. She bit her lip. "Forgive me for the indiscretion," the maid said. "But are you perhaps?" She gestured vaguely, but the meaning itself was clear enough. It was not particularly polite to ask strangers if they were homosexual, however, so he cocked an eyebrow. "Why would that matter?" Beatrice bit her lip again, then leaned closer. "She has a contract," the dark-eyed maid whispered. "I don't know the terms, but it seems to charm people, only those that are attracted to her, though, at least I think." The thief felt sick at the realization that the fucking Infanzon had been turning a contract on him the entire time she was pretending to play nice, jaw-clenching. It couldn't give her too much control over others, he knew, else she would be in breach of the Iscariot Accords and the watch would have purged the entire Ruesta family. Yet the thought that she had been seeking to influence his mind was still nauseating. He hid his anger, lest someone notice it, but there had been no avoiding the maid's eyes. It'd be safer to concede an answer to keep her on side, he decided. "I do not deal in attraction," Tristan told her. "Not physical, at least." "Asexual?" Beatrice asked. He shrugged. The thief had never much cared to put a name to his inclinations, or lack thereof, but he supposed it fit well enough. He'd caught feelings once or twice over the years, but it had not changed his distaste for sex. For all that he'd remained vague, Beatrice significantly warmed to him after. Was she truly so desperate for company that would not be charmed by her despicable mistress? It must be so, for as the two of them sat near the noble's traveling trunks the dark-haired woman gossiped away at him with great eagerness. Tristan swallowed a smile of triumph when the talk turned to the Infanzons. "She's been stringing along the Sheridan brothers for about a year now," Beatrice noted. "Making them fight for her attention, knowing they want her hand in marriage to settle their inheritance dispute." "The brothers are at odds?" Tristan casually asked. "Hate each other, more like," Beatrice snorted. "The only reason they're taking the trials is to chase Lady Isabel. If it weren't for Cosmoflora coming along to keep them in line, I'd be worried about them trying to bump each other off." He was boasting about them having to listen to him earlier, the thief shared. "He's full of shit," the maid replied. "I talked with the maids of a Sheridan cousin when Lady Isabel last called on Lord Augusto and they told me word in the house is that he is being sent as punishment. He used to be in high favor but botched some kind of affair with House Ragosa. He's here to make sure they both come back," Tristan surmised. "The poor bastard," Beatrice agreed. "It's cruel to play with them so, but I can understand why the lady doesn't want to marry them. Raymond was a real bastard even before he got his contract, but the talk since he got it is worse." He cocked his head to the side. "Apparently he trains using it on servants," she murmured. "Some sort of light he can make shackles with, but it burns the skin. Once showed me marks." "How was it?" Tristan wondered that even knowing they were monstrous he was still angered at hearing of the petty cruelty of Cherdans. "And the elder brother's as bad?" he asked. "I still have family in Feria," Beatrice said, "and they passed on rumors. He was placed in charge of the Cheriton properties there a few years back, rents and such, and he's got a reputation." The implication there was an ugly one. Tristan wished it was the first time he had heard it spoken, or that it had even the slightest chance of being the last. "How bad?" "It said he doesn't force the girls into bed," the maid admitted. "But he'll hold off on collecting a debt or rent if he's kept company." Kept company. What a gentle way to put it. They were both children of the Merc, so they knew well that in life some choices were not really choices at all. "Pieces of work," Tristan said, the hatred as in voice old and lovingly tended to. "I'm almost rooting for Ruesta to make them bare knives." "She won't," Beatrice said, shaking her head. "For the same reason I know she won't marry either. She's keeping her reputation pristine so she can get the husband she does wants." An older cousin on her mother's side, from a branch of the Livares. Tristan's brow rose. The House of Livares was one of the founding families of Sacramonte. Isabel Ruesta did not lack for ambition to seek marriage into even one of the lesser branches. "She'll need more than contract to win that," he opined. Beatrice nodded. "It's why she decided to take the trials," the maid said. "The cousin is taking them as well, gun over on the first ship. She'll be pursuing him throughout the whole mess." While playing with the Cheritons the whole time, Tristan muttered, "In fan zones. Like it won't be dangerous enough already." "She'll pick up a few others to toy with," Beatrice predicted. "Already she's sunk her hooks into that poor Mulaney girl." "The one with the saber?" "That's the one. Some kind of fallen noble from the Isles, I think," the maid shrugged. "Already smitten and getting used to prick the brothers." "At least she looks like she can handle a blade," Tristan said. "Another sword arm can't hurt on the dominion of lost things." "I suppose," she doubtfully replied. "Though I expect you'd be safer than most without," the thief said, tone carefully idle. "I'd be surprised if the Infanzones hadn't made a pact to share their soldiers." He hoped not, for it would complicate getting at Cosma and the Cheritons, but that was not the way of the world. Nobles always closed rank, hid each other's vileness. "All but Lady Vilazar," Beatrice absent-mindedly confirmed. "She's been putting off answering. But safety is a relative thing." The dark-haired maid turned an anxious but hopeful look on him. Tristan had been asked enough favors by the more desperate than he to recognize when someone was about to do it. "I saw you dicing earlier," Beatrice said. "Did you perhaps chat with a man named Ricardo?" The large Ruesta soldier, Tristan thought. The same who'd been warning everyone off Lady Isabel's two maids, since he had a claim on them. "You came up," the thief said, not beating around the bush. He seemed very certain his advances would be accepted. "I'm worried," the dark-eyed maid quietly said, "that he's certain because he won't care if I'm accepting." Tristan stilled. "You are a lady's handmaid," he slowly said. "I'm not a drapier's daughter, Tristan," Beatrice readily replied. He wouldn't dare on Ruesta grounds, but out here? "I'm just some girl plucked out of the Merc because I resembled Lady Isabel when we were children. So long as he does it out of sight." She must have been body double as well as a handmaid, he thought. Only now Beatrice was shorter and broader than Isabel Ruesta, so her value had taken a sharp dive. The two resembled each other no more than any other pair of dark-haired women close in age. "So you're looking to make friends," he said. "I can be useful to you too," Beatrice firmly retorted. "I already proved it with all the things I've been telling you, haven't I? Besides, I'm a way for you to get in with our group, and that's exactly why you've been sniffing around." He eyed the maid, a smile tugging at his lips unbidden. "A proper rat you are," Tristan praised. "Name your terms." She straightened her back. "Keep an eye out for me when he's prowling," the maid said. "If I'm sent out alone, make an excuse to follow. I don't expect you to win a fight against a soldier, but if you just delay him long enough I can run." Then she could get back to the others and make a ruckus. Lady Isabel would have to act if confronted with such a situation, else she would lose all honor and her reputation would be ruined. Who would serve a noble that did not protect her own handmaids? Still, more likely Beatrice was betting on Riccardo not being willing to take the risk of trying anything if there was a witness given the consequences of getting caught. A practical solution. Only he needed a little more from her. "I've made another friend," Tristan said. "A former soldier. I want him to be invited as well." The maid hesitated. "It's to your advantage as well," he pressed. "Two of us watching out for you, one more pair of hands if Riccardo tries his luck, and a pair trained in fighting at that." The promise of someone that might be able to handle the large Resta soldier in a fight was what tipped the decision, Tristan decided as he watched her. The dark-haired maid nodded, first with hesitation but then briskly the second time. "They'll start looking around for people to grow their numbers tomorrow," Beatrice said. "I attended to Lady Isabel this morning while they discussed it. I'll make sure you and your friend get in." "Then we have a bargain," Tristan replied. "On my oath, may 100 gods bite me should I break it." Beatrice returned the promise in kind. It was said that in ancient times the great sages of Liergan had known how to make such oaths binding, but even if the tale was true the words had long outlived the learning. Now it was simple ceremony. Before they parted ways, Tristan lightly laid a hand on her arm to stop her. "I have a wonder," he said. "Yes?" "If a great misfortune was to strike Riccardo," Tristan asked with the softness of a feather, "would you then also consider our bargain upheld?" Beatrice breathed in sharply, dark eyes searching his face. She hesitated for a long moment, only for her back to straighten again. "The hungry bite, the beggared snatch," she softly quoted back. "The cornered fight," Tristan finished. So went the law of rats, and though they might have left the merc had not left them. She did not need to speak the word for him to hear the agreement. Nodding his understanding, he bade her a silent farewell. Closing his eyes as he listened to her footsteps moving away, Tristan made himself go over the conversation again. He had made no obvious mistakes or betrayed his interest in seeing half the Infanzones aboard dead, he decided. A victory then, however uneasy it made him. He would have to ponder a way to get rid of Riccardo if the opportunity came. The pact between the nobles to share their soldiers meant killing the man would be useful anyhow. Now he only needed to sell the bargain he had struck to Young, on whose behalf he had also bargained, but he did not anticipate conflict there. The soldier had plainly told him he sought only to get to the third trial, nothing else mattering to him. Using the Infanzones for safety, at least for a time, would be a boon. The Tianxi was lying slumped in a corner and reeking of booze when Tristan found him, but his eyes were open and he was studying the lay of the hold. "Alliances are forming," Yang said, tone slurring. "Look." The thief sat before following the pointed finger, wrinkling his nose as the smell of liquor. His ally, however drunk, was correct. Groups were forming. The first around the disturbingly perfect-looking Estland that Kane recommended. The large leg-breaker from the Menermano was sitting with him, as was the pair from Asphodel, both the young noble with acne and the gaunt-exhausted man Tristan had been warned about. Leander Galatas, here on recommendation by the Navigators Guild and might hold knowledge of signs. The twins were eyeing them up as well, visibly considering tying themselves to that crew even as they spoke with the Aslan woman he knew nothing about. On the opposite end of the hold another alliance was coming together, looking a lot more convivial. The two younger Milani that Enione was keeping an eye on were chatting with the pair of Dromines that had also come together, the lot of them all close in age and well-dressed. Enione's nephew looked nervous, always looking around as if expecting to be jumped, but all four were armed and even the chubby-cheeked Romayan boy looked like he knew how to handle his pistol. With a veteran like Enione behind them, they would be a crew to reckon with. Three forces, Tristan mused. The Infanzones and their attendants, Tupac Sickle with his recruits and this band of 5. The rest, he suspected, would be leftovers. The oldest two on the boat were seated close but not talking and no one had approached them. Meanwhile the married couple was arguing in a low voice and Marcella. Where was Marcella? Probably hiding in some corner. Looking for Brun, Tristan was unsurprised to see the man Fortuna had warned him about landing on his feet. He was chatting with a flattered-looking Brasida, not a trace of sneer on the redhead maid's face. That left only the Roseni, whose name he had never learned in the well-armed Tianxi recommended by the rookery, the two of them talking when he glanced their way. A conversation soon ended, though, and they went different ways. "Did you get anything out of the maid?" Yang asked. "A bargain," Tristan murmured. "We watch her back against the Rue guard, and she gets us in with the infanzones." The Tianxi soldier let out a whistle that was a little too loud, drawing eyes to them. Tristan pushed down a squirm of discomfort. "Good work," Yang praised. "I was thinking we'd have to work our way in with Tupac's crew, but the nobles are a better horse to ride." "He approached you?" Tristan asked. "Came around," the drunk said. "But he's gathering killers, and I don't want to be one of them unless I know why." The thief grunted in agreement. "He's not the only one that got curious," Yang continued. "The Roseni's been keeping an eye on you all afternoon." Tristan forced himself not to look at her and give the game away. "She speak to anyone so far?" "That Tianxi girl that walks like she's done republic drills," the soldier began to list. "Brun, that terrified girl you rubbed elbows with. Oh, and the Ramayan gunslinger, but only before the pair started cozying up with the Mulaney. Looking for allies? If so, she was not doing well." The thief glanced her way and found she was standing alone. It was hard to tell anything about her, given the way Roseni dressed whenever they left their city-state. The woman wore a gray dress that went down to knee-high boots, embroidered leather gloves, and layered gray veils that reached halfway down her torso and were kept in place by a painted wooden circle atop her head. The only opening was for the eyes, a dull copper mask carefully worn there to keep everything covered except the eyeholes. It was said the folk of Razum thought their island the only untented land in all of Vesper, hiding their bodies outside it so they would not lead evil back to their home. All Tristan could tell about the Roseni was that she was about of height with him, tall for a woman, and that those gloves and boots were worn from use. The boots in particular were. The thief stilled. "Young," he murmured. "Look at the Roseni's boots." "They do look comfortable," the Tianxi agreeably replied. "What color would you say the stitches are?" The soldier shot him a strange look. "Dark blue," he finally said, shrugging. So they were. Tristan had not met many Roseni, but back when he'd run messages for Aroya frontman near the docks he learned a few things about them. Like the way they never wore anything blue below the belt, since it drew the attention of evil gods. There was no way a Roseni religious enough to observe full veiling would not know that. "Which means I'm not looking at a Roseni." Hitching himself up, the thief brushed his trousers clean before working away from a baffled Yang. Unhurried, Tristan crossed the hold until he reached the false Roseni and leaned against the wall to her left. "I do not believe," the stranger said, "that we have been introduced." No accent. Her Antigua had that cadence to it common to those who'd learned the language late, but nothing about the way she spoke hinted about where she was from. It was, he mused, an aggressively unaccented way of speaking, and so almost certainly practiced. He didn't immediately reply, instead leaning his head back against the wall. When he finally spoke, his tone was barely above a whisper. "I am trying to think," the thief said, "of a reason for why you'd pick Razan of all places as way to hide your identity. I can't seem to find one." He looked up at the ceiling, the play of shadows lined by the lantern lights. "In old Soraya masks are worn by certain trades," he said, "and surely hair dye would have been easier than going around in a full Roseni veiling if you only sought to hide your identity. Are you accusing me of something?" "You're wearing blue under the belt," Tristan plainly said. "Roseni do not." "Not unless we have been exiled," she replied. A tense moment passed. "Did you think I'd buy that?" he curiously asked. A sigh, then she shuffled on her feet. "I should have sprung for the boots without stitches," she muttered. He hummed. Her eyes were blue, he glimpsed through the slits of the copper mask. "You're not going to introduce yourself?" she asked. "You've kept an eye on me all day," the thief said. "You already know my name." "I guess, but one he liked his odds on." She did not deny it. "So the Tianxi's your ally," the stranger said. "Thought as much. You had to be looking close to notice that," he said. "What is it you've been looking at us for?" "I haven't decided yet," she lightly replied. "Besides, that's ahead of us. Here and now I would like to offer you a deal." He cocked his head to the side. "Your silence," the veiled woman offered, "for knowledge that might save your life." Tristan eyed her searchingly, but there was no face to read, only dull copper and cloth. It might end up useful leverage to out her as an impostor, he considered, but it was not certain. Most here did not have a reason to care. Better to get something certain than hold on to something he might never use. And if she told him something useless? Then he would still have learned something, only about her. "Agreed," he replied. The noblewoman picked up by the infant zones, the stranger said, has 10 silver lines tattooed on her left arm. "So she's a Milani swordmistress," Tristan frowned. They were dangerous folk, he'd heard, feared even by the bloodthirsty champions of Aztlan warrior societies. "No," the woman said. "It's on the wrong arm, in the wrong color. She's a Perdiri mirror dancer. Wasn't Purwater part of the kingdom of Malin? One of the islands?" "There's a difference, I take it," the thief said. "Swordmasters gain their lines in honor duels. Bloody fights, but deaths aren't common. On the High Isle, to win a line you are taken to the shore on a specific day of the year. To duel. In a manner of speaking," she said. "There's a kind of lemur there called gray mirrors. They prey on lone travelers and fishermen, taking their form and then eating the body to gain some of its memories." Tristan's disbelieving gaze, against his will, went to the noblewoman they were talking about. Blissfully unaware of the attention, she was telling a story to the villager. "You can't be serious. They wait until the mirror takes the form of the one trying for the line," the stranger evenly said, "then toss her the sword of its own, for fairness. They win or die, facing themselves year after year. If the Mala the Perdiri could only take such a trial once a year and she had 10 stripes, she must have begun when she was still a child. 10, 11? Young. Don't ever face that woman sword in hand," the stranger warned, "unless you are looking to die." That was knowledge well worth a secret kept, and Tristan did not hide his appreciation. He'd come out ahead in this bargain, perhaps even a little too much. Best to even the scales, lest he be in the stranger's debt. "The Ruestal girl has a contract that charms others," he murmured. "Though there are restrictions." The veiled woman stayed silent for a moment. "That," she finally said, "could be trouble." It was obvious enough he did not bother to voice agreement. Besides, he'd got what he came here for and more. It was time to take his leave. "Since you have my name," Tristan said, "it would only be fair for me to receive yours." She shot him a considering look, as if debating what she would use. "Sorry. It's been worthwhile, sorry," he said, inclining his head. "So it has," she agreed. "We'll speak again on the island." Surprisingly, he found himself looking forward to it. He had barely taken a step away from the veiled woman when he heard a gunshot, body tensing as he went for his knife. He realized a moment later that it had come from the decks above. Though he'd not been the only one alarmed, there were several others on their feet and just as wary. A second later another shot sounded, then what had to be a dozen more. They did not stop. "We're under attack," Cosmoflor shouted. "Arm yourselves." "Pirates? Surely not, for what kind of a fool would attack a watch ship when they carried few goods and were certain to be full of soldiers?" Even as the travelers of the hold went for their weapons, Tristan's gaze swept through them again as instinct had him counting the heads. Shit, the thief thought. Marcella was still missing. The same terrified girl he was certain had been drawing on her contract compulsively since coming on board. A sinking feeling in his stomach, Tristan brushed past the pair of Dramians and climbed atop one of the crates in the back. He heard a man's voice laughing, asking if he was going to hide, but he ignored it as he crawled forward. The back of the hold was a tightly packed mass of crates, but over one's edge Tristan saw some sort of cloth peeking out. Cursing again he crawled closer, seeing then it was not cloth at all. It was some sort of webbing, like a spider's. And behind that crate, nesting among threads of webbing, was horror. What had been Marcella barely clung on to human shape, milky blind eyes having grown all over her head, while spindly legs ending in claws had ripped their way out of her sides and torso. She held herself in her own arms, the skin webbed together, and when a noise of terrified disgust ripped its way out of Tristan's throat, she suddenly twitched. "She's waking up." Milky eyes swam into focus and the thief threw himself back. "Saint," he shouted. "Saint in the hold." He didn't even see what hit him, a keening sound filling his ears as pain exploded across his back and he tumbled through a broken crate. "Fuck," his shoulder. Tristan rose out of a spill of seeds just in time to see the Saint scuttling through the hold, while half a dozen people fired at it, carelessly slapping down the Aslan leg breaker when it stood in her way. The god-wearing Marzella let out a moaning sound when shots tore at its flesh, but it would take more than musket balls to put it down. Not that it seemed inclined to stay at the bottom of the ship. Bleeding black itcher, the monster climbed up the wall to the ceiling and ripped its way clean through the wood. "Oh spirits," someone moaned. Even as it climbed through the hole, the Saint let out another keening moan before disappearing. A moment later Tristan got a glimpse of what the blastcloaks had been shooting at all this time. Mantics. Of all the bloody things, it was mantics. Leering creatures barely 2 feet long, dragging themselves on long clawed hands as their disturbingly human faces bared fangs. Only the scavengers were gone wild, spilling down into the hold by the dozens and savagely going for those closest to them. Tristan backed away from the mess, watching as Tupac-Sickle calmly finished putting together a spear and harpooned the closest Lars without batting an eye. Violence broke the spell of surprise, the rest of the hold exploding into action. Keeping an eye on the Infanzones, Tristan saw that they were already moving towards the upper deck. Looking to the blastcloaks to save their necks, no doubt. But they were leaving fighters behind, only Cosm heading up with them, and the cold place in the back of his mind saw the opening. The mirror dancer was sticking close to Isabel Ruesta, and since the Infanzones were sharing soldiers, that meant. The thief moved towards his medicine cabinet. While Mantix kept slithering down and fighting sounded above, he discreetly grabbed a small vial from the upper right compartment and felt out the lining of the door. There were long needles, just like he learned in Alvareno's dosages, and he palmed one. A look told him that Beatrice was on her way up with her mistress and that Young was fine. Though visibly drunk, he was reloading his pistol without fumbling, so there was no need to stick his neck out. Better to wait for his moment, and until then take the opportunity he'd been handed. That crone Salipa had promised to see him beaten if he got into the crates, but now one was open and no one likely to be paying attention if he had a look at what was inside the others. Even as he uncorked the vial he'd taken and dipped the needle in the brown, viscous spinster's milk within, he snuck into the back of the hold. The vial was tucked away carefully, as was the needle, and he turned his attention to the mystery. He had been thrown into seeds earlier, but prying open other crates showed him the rest of the goods. At least 2 full of muskets, powder and swords, another of trinkets, but there was a lot of food. Some was military rations, but also dried meats and a large amount of those cheap seeds, the kind that didn't come from glare crops and so ended up used only to feed poor men and darklings. What does the watch garrison on the island need with so much food? Something to keep in mind, though he best ends this before he was caught. Leaving the cover of the crates, Tristan returned to find the tail end of the fight. Most the travelers had gone up like the Infanzones, leaving only a handful behind to hold the stairs as Mantix kept slithering in through the hole in the ceiling. "Tristan," Inyani called out. "Hurry, we're closing the door." Clutching his knife tightly, the thief tiptoed around the pack of scavengers being kept at bay by swords and a musket fixed with a bayonet. The noise caught their attention, and unlike the others he'd not earned their fear by piling up a few corpses, they came at him hard. Waddling forward with deceptive quickness, the Mantix moved to cut him off as he broke into a run, and though he leapt over the first that tried to bite his leg, he was caught after he landed. Claws ripped into his trousers and he hissed in pain, slashing at the creature's eyes. It howled in pain as he ripped through flesh, releasing him just fast enough he was able to run to the bottom of the stairs before the rest could do more than nip at his heels. "See, I told you he was too slippery to die," Inyani drawled, idly slashing away at the Mantix. It held them back, Tristan saw. It wouldn't have earlier, when the Saint had been there and they were gone entirely rabid. Now they were capable of fear again. Too slippery to fight, too, Ricardo grunted. That got him contemptuous look from the remaining two, Inyani's nephew and the acne-ridden noblewoman from Asphodel. Best to nip it in the bud, he still had a use for a decent reputation. I was looking to see if the Saint left anything behind, he lied. She looks like a spider, so I was concerned of eggs. Ah, and away went the contempt. Shit, Inyani's nephew quietly said. Were there any? Couldn't find some, but I can't be sure. I didn't want to risk touching the webbing, Tristan said, feigning reluctance at the confession. That was wise of you, the Asphodel noble assured him. Nothing come of a Saint is harmless. We can all pat ourselves on the back later, Ricardo cut in. Let's close this damn door and bar it shut, we wasted long enough. Tristan smoothed away his smile. He'd known the Ruesta soldier would be there. See, every other Infanzon would have a sword hanged already with them. Kozan for the Sheridan brothers, Sonali for the Vilazar, and finally the Perduri for Isabel Ruesta. Ricardo was bound to be the one they left behind, and they had to leave someone behind so it wasn't too obvious they'd abandoned everyone the moment danger arrived. Reputation and honor, yes? So now he only needed to play his part. How fortunate that Ricardo was such a prick he hadn't even had to bait out an insult. They'll attack when there's fewer of us, Tristan said. Like scavengers always do. The last of us will have a fight on their hands. Inyani nodded, about to speak up when Tristan sniffed. He painted offended pride on his face. Ricardo and I can take the role, if he so doubts I can handle a knife, the thief said. There was no argument. None of the others would clamor for the place of danger, and Ricardo couldn't even begin to try wiggling out of this without withdrawing his careless insult from earlier. Which the man would not, because he was a prick. And so as the others began to withdraw up the stairs, Tristan palmed the long needle he had put away earlier. To be safe, he waited until the third time the Mantics came after them. He half-slipped on the stairs, drawing the scavengers after him eagerly, and even as he scampered back up the stairs in the chaos he pricked the large man in the fat of the leg. Ricardo yelped and glared down, but Tristan withdrew quick enough it looked like a Mantic had been at fault. The thief scampered up, the two of them keeping the creatures away as the others disappeared up the stairs one by one. Tristan waited. Spinster's milk was an extract from a breed of lemures commonly known as Chaotl spinsters, horse-sized scorpions that had earned the sobriquet because their venom was not mortal. As if needy spinsters, the beasts instead paralyzed their prey so they could eat them alive bite by bite. So Ricardo did not die, as that would have been much too suspicious. Instead he slowed, limbs growing numb, and then made a mistake. When time came to avoid a snap of teeth the large soldier misjudged the length of steps and down Ricardo went. Tumbling down the stairs and into the pack of hungry Mantics, who would conveniently eat the evidence. Hurry, Inyani hissed into his ear, dragging him by the shoulder. He's dead, kid, there's no helping him. The thief made sure to protest once that he could still save his beloved comrade Ricardo before allowing himself to be talked into abandoning him. He was not an amateur, so he did not smile as the door closed behind him. 1. Tristan Abrascal counted. Chapter 6. Teeth shattered most satisfyingly under her boot, the Mantic whimpering as it fled. Angharade added a flourish to her wrist purely for effect, spearing the spirit from behind and nailing it to the deck before setting a fang-strewn boot on its head and ripping her saber clear. She flicked the itcher off the blade, eyes scanning the lower deck for enemies. Her comrade in arms did the same from her left, his own sword slick with black blood. We're past the worst of it, Cosmoflora decided. The gun ports are closed. How the scavengers had managed to get the cannon holes open in the first place was a mystery, though not one it was her duty to solve. She would settle for gladness at the Mantics no longer crawling through them like a tide of vermin. Though the fighting was still hard above, where the Saint had fled, it seemed that the lower deck was near swept clean. The last stragglers from the hold had barricaded the door, and now the same blast cloaks that had stormed the deck to close the ports were gathering around the hole in the floor to take shots with their muskets. It wouldn't be enough to clear the numbers that had gathered down there, but it would thin the herd. And with few dead, Angharad said, I must admit to having underestimated Watchman. Even seasoned Mullaney crews would have panicked at the sheer number of spirits that had climbed the ship, but the men and women of the watch had responded with calm discipline. They'd formed into squads, put their back to a wall and swept forward with powder and steel. You're not so bad yourself, Tredegar, the older man grinned. With his salt and pepper beard and roguish smile, the Sheridan soldier might have set another woman's heart aflutter, but here he was very much barking up the wrong tree. He was a loyal retainer and skilled at arms, however, so Angharad refrained from rolling her eyes. He'd proved a good man by standing in the defense of others, and that earned him consideration. My skills have not rusted, she simply replied. And yours are worthy of praise. We did not let a single one through. Through was made plain by her glance back, where the ship's arsenal had been turned into a cutter's room. The Bluebell surgeon, Angharad hoped she was no Leargan doctor, for those were known to be deadlier than the plague, was seeing to the wounded, her door guarded by only a pair of blast cloaks. More were unneeded, given the veritable phalanx of passengers that had gathered to take up the duty as well. Near a dozen in all, protecting not only the wounded but also the cowardly. Of the Infanzones only Lady Ferranda had stayed out the surgeon's workroom to fight. Lady Isabel was to be forgiven, given that she was no trained fighter and capable enough to serve as the surgeon's assistant besides, but the Sheridan brothers had shamed themselves by hiding. By the occasional looks of contempt thrown their way by their shipmates, it had done their reputation no favors. There are no true nobles in Sacramonte, Angharad reminded herself, trying to temper her own scorn. Long gone were the days of the Second Empire, with only the dust of greatness remaining. Besides, she would not let her growing interest in Lady Isabel unfairly sour her opinion of those courting her. She was no longer a girl, to think that her every rival must be a sot or a devil. Good work all around, Cosme affably agreed. Now we just need to settle in and wait for the watch to clear the upper deck. Shouts above punctuated the sentence, followed by musket shots. The fight there had been raging before the first Mantic ever set foot in the hold, and by the sound of it had yet to abate. Angharad paused at the man's words, weighing the demands of honor. She was a guest and saw owed protection by her house, which did not demand she fight on behalf of the watch. Yet she also owed them a personal debt for the way they had defended her at the docks when the Guardia came to take her, and it would be the height of ingratitude to stay her hand when she could return the courtesy. The words exactor a sword, Anga, her father had once told her, so when wielding them you must hold on tight to the spirit of honor lest it slip your grasp. She had never loved her father's lessons, for they were of men's things, land-holding and intrigue, squabbles about estate boundaries and cattle-drinking rights, but he had been wise in his own way. Softer than mother, who'd been born harsh and whittled sharp by a life out at sea, but in matters of honor she thought him wisest. Vesper would be a fairer place if Moore acted like him, and Angharad would not dishonor the grave she'd dug him by betraying his teachings now. If there is a fight to be had, my blade will not shy from it, she said, squaring her shoulders. It has been a pleasure, Master of Floor. The older man's face betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he nodded back politely. He did not offer to accompany her, nor had she expected him to. It would have been improper of him, as his life was not his own to risk. He had come here as the retainer of the Sheridan brothers, to put his flesh between peril and their own. Parting ways without further ado, Angharad tightened her grip around her sword and made for the stairs. Half a squad of blast cloaks was already there, the noblewoman's earlier benefactor, Salipa, the one-armed sailor, leading them. The grizzled officer was in talks with a blond young man, and Angharad caught the tail end of it without meaning to. Rave of you, but that thing'll chew you up, Salipa said. Best you just stay out of the way. The captain will make his move soon. I am not entirely helpless, Tia, the young man replied. Besides, it appears in great need. Having a contract doesn't make you a fucking god, boy, Salipa retorted. It makes you meet with a fancy trick. Then let him come with me, Angharad cut in as she approached. I assure you, my lady, I am far helpless. The grizzled woman turned on her a gimlet eye. I already told you I'm not a god-fucking lady, girl, Salipa grunted, then sighed. But I know that stubborn look on your face. Bloody Trediggers. She muttered something about black powder and ramming under her breath, then glared at them half-heartedly before stomping up the stairs. Angharade smoothed away a smile, having been reminded of the old sea dogs her mother liked to keep around. However loud the bark, they were never quite as dour as they liked to pretend. Turning to the men, she looked him up for a weapon, a short hatchet, touched by Itcher in a way betraying use, even as she offered her hand. Lady Angharade Trediger, she introduced herself. Introductions were in order if they were to fight side by side. Bron of Sekramonti, the man replied, shaking it. He had a common look about him, Angharade thought, but there was a steadiness to his bearing that was calming. His grip was firm, a sign of good character. Hurry up, you two, Salipa called out. The man's lips twitched, a sentiment she fully returned, and they passed the rest of the watchmen to join Salipa and another where they were kneeling near the top of the stairs. It was not, however, a blast cloak that waited there. A long musket laid along the line of the floor, the mysterious stranger that had approached Angharade earlier keeping her silver eyes on the ruckus above. From where she stood Angharade could see little more than the dark sky and the flashing lights of lanterns, but the woman, Song, was positioned to see it all. She's taken another 2 shots, and whatever the captain's doing to the sea seems to be working, Song announced without ever looking away. She'll scuttle back up the mast soon, so we should run out on my mark. The 2 of you best listen to her, Salipa turned to say. It'll do wonders for your lifespan. You will be joining the fray as well, then? Angharade asked, looking past her. Song nodded. We need to put the saint down as quickly as possible, she said. The longer she is about, the higher the chances she tears up sails. For the daughter of a famous explorer, Angharade admittedly knew shamefully little about seafaring, but she knew enough to predict what might happen to a sailing ship bereft of sails. Get ready, Song murmured. Angharade tensed, legs coiling. Now. The 3 of them ran out onto the deck, right into Hell's bastard cousin. A sweep of 20 blast cloaks had hauled up in the Bluebell's forecastle, muskets out and sifting through anything that approached, but the remainder of the deck was bloody chaos. Strands of some sort of oily webbing were crisscrossing the length of the floor, some even hanging from the mass, while Mantics threw themselves at a squad of blast cloaks with blind fury. They must have been chased out of the aftercastle, which had been ripped apart, and now the corpses of scavengers and sailors were messily strewn across the deck. Black powder clouds billowed thick as claw and blade clashed half-blind in the shivering lantern light, spirits and men furiously slashing at each other. Saint up the mast. Angharade saw no trace of the rampaging spirit they were being warned about, or indeed of much of anything at all. It was like stepping into an angry beehive. Don't walk on the webbing, Song shouted into the din. It attracts them. To the forecastle, Angharade shouted back. We can plan from there. I'll take the front, Brun volunteered. The noblewoman blinked at the courageous offer. There was no telling what lay on the other side of the powder smoke, and before she could answer the man was moving. They could do little but follow, hurrying as much as they could without stepping onto webbing. There were snarls from the side of she-ship, a pair of Mantic leaping over the railing. Brun's hatchet split once head open before it could even bring up its claws, the butt of Song's musket catching the other in the flank and smashing it down onto the deck. The Tianxi reached for the sword at her side, but Angharade moved quicker. A calm thrust through the dazed spirit's soft skull finished it. We need to keep moving, Song said, but not before offering a nod of thanks. They'd caught the attention of the musketmen on the forecastle, enough that when they emerged from a choking cloud of powder a few shots were sent their way to clear their path. Angharade cursed as claws ripped at the back of her boots and scratched her heel, kicking at the spirit's face until its eyes popped wetly. A pair of blast cloaks even came their way, swords in hand, a gaunt man she recalled having seen in the hold accompanying them, and the 3 cleared their way through a pack of snapping Mantics to join them. No, Song suddenly shouted. Galatas, you're... There was an unearthly screech from above as Angharade's eyes went to the gaunt man, seeing a moment too late what Song had noticed. The edge of his left foot was touching webbing. Half a hundred mantics turned their way in the moment that followed, though it was the whip-fast shape that landed on the deck that made Angharaide's breath catch in her throat. She'd not had a good look at the saint before, when it fled up, but now she beheld the full horror and trembling lantern light. A girl's body with 9 burst-out spindly legs, the torso a nightmare of melted flesh, and a once human head now marred by huge wet eyes. Ribs peeked out of her flesh, webbing leaking out of them, and Angharade almost retched at the sight. There was a reason the sleeping gods' diviners taught that spirits and men should never share a single flesh. "Run," Sung hissed. Shots sounded, but too slowly. Before the powder blew, the saint had already impaled one of the blast cloaks and thrown aside the other like a sack of radishes, the fool who touched the webbing tripping as he tried to hurry backwards. 2 musket shots tore through the saint's torso, tearing bloody holes, but she just shook off the blast cloak she had impaled and casually ripped through the other one's shoulder. "Salt munitions," a voice called out from the forecastle. The glare-drenched salt, Angharade knew, was as poison to most spirits. But the spirit was already moving, ready to scuttle back into the smoke and dark to ready for the snatching of more lives, and so she made her decision. Honor had its demands. She grabbed Sung's shoulder before the other woman could run. "Get the wounded to the forecastle," she ordered. "Have Brun help." "What are you?" Angharade did not look back, striding out saber in hand. The saint looked about to finish the blast cloak with the stomach wound, so the Perduri calmly stepped on the strand of webbing before her. The saint paused, neck twisting sharply to look back, and Angharade felt her stomach drop. Death. She had courted death, and now it was coming on blood-drenched legs to take her. Her body moved by rote, back straightening as the flat of her saber lightly tapped her left shoulder in a duelist salute. She glimpsed. The legs tore through her belly, turning to open her up, and stepped lightly to the right, pivoting even as the spirit screeched and slashing at its back. Leathery flesh parted under good Perduri steel, splashing itcher even as the saint lashed out blindly. Left leg, Angharade thought, catching the twitch early. A step back, leaning away, and the pointed tip passed half an inch below her chin. She threw her weight forward, pushing with the back leg, and struck with the strength of her entire body. The saber carved through the leg she'd aimed at, one of the 4 the saint was standing on, and the maddened spirit tipped back. A glimpse. Over the shoulder, the tips of the legs going through Angharade's eyes, and she slid down under the saint as front legs twisted over the spirit's shoulders, nailing the deck where she'd just stood. Landing in a crouch, she left a shallow cut on the spirit's chest as she rose. From the corner of her eye she caught the twitch a moment before the saint moved, pivoting to sweep from the right with 3 legs. Angharade simply stepped out of the swing, air whipping about her face, and she felt the dread drip out of her heartbeat by heartbeat. 8 legs left, the saint coming at her relentlessly, and yet there was nothing to fear. She was back home, doing the reprimand in the fighting yard. It was a mad spirit coming at her from all angles instead of swinging stones, yet it was just the same. Watch, listen and move. Be as the wave, unhurried yet inexorable. A shot clipped the saint's shoulder and the spirit pivoted, but Angharade clicked her tongue and thrust shallowly into the creature's side. For pain, for attention. "Eyes on me," she chided, and the spirit turned back with a skittering shriek. A glimpse told her a mantic was to come upon her from behind, but also what would follow. Angharade moved to the side of a puncturing leg, pivoting and slashing at the saint's back even as the head of the scavenger come for her burst into gore. The blast cloaks on the forecastle were covering her back. The saint bent back, wildly scrabbling forward with half a dozen legs, but the Perduri took to the left and ducked under a lateral blow that would have shattered her rib cage. It was not just aiming poorly, she realized as the spirit struggled to turn while she slashed at her back legs, but not aiming at all. Like the stones swinging at the end of ropes that she had trained with back home, the trajectory of the saint's blows did not change after they began. She's faster than her own senses can follow. That made her predictable, Angharade thought with a wolfish smile, and she knew how to punish predictable. Left, blindingly and blinded quick, the point ripping into the wood as Angharade stepped back. Right, as the twitch had told her, but a spirit that could not even control its own strength could hardly control the distance, The Perduree dove forward, letting the saint swing off her up, two of the legs jutting out of her chest cleanly. With a heave and grunt, Angharad cut through the base of both as the spirit let out a deafening screech. She went wild, legs hacking at the front of her, but Angharad had already slipped to the left. Musket fire lit up the night, tearing smoking holes into the saint's back, and the spirit shuddered in pain. Salt shots, Angharad thought. The saint turned towards the forecastle, legs convulsing, and leapt. Only the gunman from earlier was there, elbowing watchman aside as he traced something in the air, and the billowing darkness of the gloam formed into a sign that merely glancing at had Angharad nauseous. At the apex of her leap, the saint hit thin air as if it were a solid wall and let out a shrieking moan of surprise as she tumbled back down in a sprawl. "Finish it!" a blast cloak shouted. Musket fire bloomed and Angharad sprang towards the downed saint, black slicked blade raised high. Others came too, watchmen with pikes and swords as well brun, and a graceful Estland man wielding a spear. They hacked at the spirit's legs while she flailed in pain from the musket fire pouring down from above, Angharad only joining the fray reluctantly. For all that she knew this was no true honored duel, the disparity in numbers still made the business feel disreputable. She thrust into the spirit's back, dipping away from a flailing blow, and as she did noticed that webbing was trailing across the deck in thick rivulets. Frowning, Angharad took another step back and realized that the oily trails were connecting with the earlier ones, spreading somehow, and that mantics were flocking to the web. "Something's wrong," the noblewoman called out. "The saint is—" Her words were good as drowned out by the musket fire, but even that raclet was chased out when the saint's death throes bloomed into a sky-piercing shriek. She staggered away from the sound, ears ringing, and watched in horror as the saint's wounds began to close and fresh legs burst out from the stumps. All over the ship mantics were melting into the webbing, flesh dissolving. The saint rose, crushing a pair of blast cloaks with a casual swing as Angharad kicked a scavenger that had snuck up to her side, but the gunman from earlier was back. Cheeks flush with color, he traced that same foul sign between the spirit and the blast cloaks, only this when the saint struck there was a crack. A scream, then the sign shattered and Angharad saw the man's forearm turn into blackened pulp. "No," the Perduree shouted, seeing their victory turn to ash. She glimpsed, sweeping her legs and leapt above a swing, just in time for the edge of a blow to catch her shoulder and smash her back down in a spinning crash. She saw it coming then, too quick for a glimpse to help at all, the two legs coming down to nail her belly to the deck. Only there was a musket shot and the very tip of a leg blew as it came down, the stump smacking into the other and nudging it just to the side of Angharad's ribs. It tore through her freshly mended coat instead, the Perduree catching sight of a pleased smile under silver eyes before she hurried to rip her way free. Song had saved her life, somehow landing that preposterous shot. She would not waste the chance she had been given, the noblewoman swore, and was gritting her teeth to throw herself back into the melee when suddenly a door burst open. The room under the forecastle, Angharad saw, which had been locked and barred all this time. The captain's quarters. Now it was wide open and a fat, dark-skinned man in a watch cloak strode out, strands of gloam following him like eager pups. The saint struck at the captain but found the same sign it had twice faced waiting. Only this time it was the spirit's leg that was pulped when it hit thin air, and the captain calmly began to circle the saint as he traced the same symbol anew. Once, twice, thrice more the saint broke herself on seemingly nothing until she was caught in a four-sided box. "Grenades," the captain ordered. Angharad watched as half a dozen watchmen on the forecastle took out, lit and threw the Tianxi metal orbs over the lid of the invisible box. The captain, a member of the Guild of Navigators, he had to be, had formed. Seconds later, before the saint could think of trying to climb out, there was a blinding thunder and itcher sprayed all over transparent panes of nothing. The fat captain frowned, then spat to the side as the smoke dispersed and revealed nothing more than twitching shreds of meat. "Salt her and box the remains," he called out. "Peeling society still has that bounty up on incomplete saints." Angharad swallowed. Incomplete. That spirit had been incomplete? Sleeping God, putting down saints wasn't even considered the most perilous duty of the watch. The Blastcloaks fanned out from the forecastle in good order, a squad tending to the broken spirit's remains, and as the noblewoman scanned the deck for dangers she saw that the fight was done. What mantics had not been devoured by the saint were fleeing hastily, scuttling back into the dark waters. Few of the watchmen bothered to strike at them, and none with muskets. They were saving their powder, Angharad thought. And just like that, with nary a cheer from the victors, the battle was over. Most looked punch-drunk at the suddenness of the end, though it did not prevent a few of the younger sailors from crowding her. The dark-skinned noble blinked, taken aback by the excited chatter. She had, it seemed, impressed through her duel with the saint. It was like nothing I've seen before, a boy that could not be older than 14 said. They'd be mad not to want you in the Skiritai. Angharad was only passingly familiar with the circles, the 7 societies within the watch where only the most elite watchmen were inducted, but she had heard of the Skiritai Guild. Militants, its members were called, or even more bluntly swords. They were the finest warriors of the watch, which made the boy's words a weighty compliment. I have had fine training, but I claim little experience with the horrors of the old knight, Angharad demurred. You must have a damned impressive contract, a fair-haired woman her age said. It was like you moved to dodge it before it even struck. Angharad's lip thinned. Inquiring of contracts was impolite, and to the watchwoman's honor she coughed in embarrassment. There might be a time where the Perdiri would be forced to speak of her contract with the fisher, but even then she intended to hold back the truth and claim her gift was one of quickened reflexes. Lying sat ill with her, but she had little choice. Foretelling contracts were strictly forbidden in the kingdom of Malin, the High Queen's decree punishing them by death, and one day Angharad must return home to take vengeance. The secret must keep, however dishonorable the keeping of it. She was saved from the need to answer by the arrival of comrades in arms, the young Blastcloaks retreating to give them privacy. Bronn of Sacramonte, steady soul that he had proved to be, came to her while wiping his hatchet clean of fresh ichor. He had not shied from fighting. Song, her long dark hair held in a plaited braid, had slung her musket on her back. She was pristine, save for a smudge of grease on her chin. Angharad wasted no time in acknowledging the truth, offering the Tianxi a deep bow. I owe you my life, the Perdiri said. I am in your debt. And we are all in yours, Song replied, shaking her head. If you had not held on against the saint until Captain's Fazot arrived, there would be a great many more corpses on the floor. Angharad disagreed, for her life had been saved in the specific while she had only helped in the general sense, but she would not make an argument of it. One's honor lay in one's hands, not the eyes of others. She would remember the debt and repay it regardless of what Song might say. You have my gratitude nonetheless, Angharad said. I am only grieved the captain could not come sooner. She let an unspoken question hang there, which Bronn caught easily enough. The Sacramontan smiled. I asked the same, he admitted. They tell me Captain Fazot came so late because he was seeing to the rest of the mantics. Angharad's brow rose. He wove signs around the ship, a ring of wind that kept more of them from climbing aboard, Song said. An impressive display. He must be a member in good standing of the Aquiller Guild. Though most called that circle the Navigators Guild, its true name was the one Song had used. But its members, known as Navigators, were in some ways the most famous of the watch, so the parlance had stuck. He turned the tide as soon as he appeared, Angharad acknowledged. Watchmen are not to be trifled with. Though it would have been proper to continue with some casual talk, the noblewoman made her excuses not long after. She felt exhausted to the bone and her coat was half a ruin. Making her way below, she offered Salipa a nod, returned, before heading to the arsenal, where the ship's cutter was seeing to the worst of the wounded. Near the door Isabel was catching her breath, the leather apron she wore stained with blood from her time assisting the surgeon. The Infanzona saw her coming and a pleased smile tugged at her lips. I hear you made something of a stir upstairs, Isabel said. Congratulations are in order. I only did my duty, Angharad said, debating whether or not to play up humility a bit. Perhaps not. The dark-haired beauty seemed more taken by boldness than the opposite. A gentle touch on her arm, warm through her sweat-stained shirt, jolted Angharade straight out of her exhaustion. "You've ruined your coat again," Isabel laughed. "A casualty of war," she sullenly replied. "I will have my maids mend it," Isabel told her, a teasing glint lighting up those lovely green eyes. "Though if you keep making a habit of that, I'll start wondering if it is all a way to keep me close." "Entirely for your protection, of course," Angharade smirked. "Protection, Isabel mused. "Is that what they call it in Perimeter?" Angharade's heartbeat quickened. This was the closest either had come to acknowledging her attraction, and that Isabel did not seem put off in the slightest. She had even brought it up. Seemed promising indeed. She cleared her throat. "It is my duty as a peer to teach our customs to all interested," she smoothly replied. "It would be my very great pleasure to offer lessons." Isabel's lips twitched. "I'll consider it," she airily replied. Their moment was interrupted by a hoarse scream from the arsenal, Isabel flinching at the loudness. "I must return to Dr. Balber's side," she said, laying her hand on Angharade's arm again. "Be well." It was an effort not to lean into the touch, but the noblewoman mastered herself and offered a dignified nod back instead. She watched Isabel disappear past the threshold, feeling giddy as a girl. How long had it been since she'd last been so taken with another? Too long. The unrelenting pursuit of assassins had drained the joy out of her life, and it could only be a victory to claw some small piece of it back. In too great a vigor for her original intention of finding a corner to sleep in, Angharade instead strode the length of the lower deck. The Cheriton brothers were seated in a corner, pointedly alone save for their valet, but Lady Ferrando was speaking with a pair of Someshwari. Angharade joined them for a short chat, exchanging introductions and compliments. The man of the pair, rather rounded in shape and lacking in muscle, was called Ishan and of noble birth. The other, short and shapely, was named Shalini. They had come together. "We've known each other since we're kids," Shalini said, smiling like one to whom smiles came easy and often. "I couldn't let him wander off into adventure alone." "She's a much better shot," Ishan admitted. There were plenty who had an eye on her talents back home. He looked, Angharade thought, a little guilty at that. "Serving some dusty old Raj as a showpiece champion or going into the watch with you?" Shalini said, rolling her eyes. "What a difficult choice that was, Isha." Angharade shared a glance with Lady Ferrando, the two amused by the obvious affection between the pair. Making gentle sport of them would have been a pleasant way to pass the time, but the Perduri caught sight of two men towering over another across the deck and frowned. To Aslan, one a bear of a man with a broken nose and the other the graceful spear wielder she glimpsed above, were flanking a dark-haired man standing by some sort of cabinet. Were they taking advantage of the watch's distraction to break hospitality? Making her excuses with the others, Angharade strode over briskly. All three turned to her. "Good evening," the noblewoman flatly said. "Does there happen to be some trouble?" The big man scowled at her. "Fuck off, Mullany," he said. "We are just, be polite to our friend here, O'Cotlan," the other Aslan interrupted. "Good evening, Lady Tredegar." "And to you," Angharade reluctantly replied. The big man had not liked being interrupted, but he did not argue. He stood, Angharade thought, as if he were wary of his younger companion. Tupac Sickle, the pale-eyed Aslan, introduced himself, offering a hand. Formerly of the Leopard Society. The noblewoman shook it, manners demanding as much, but her eyes sought out the dark-haired loner. He had the Sacramontan look about him, his scruffy dark hair and tan skin paired with deep gray eyes. He was also rather disheveled and very obviously of common birth. He met her gaze with mild curiosity and little else. "Tristan," he introduced himself. "A pleasure, my lady." "Shared," Angharade replied, more politely than truthfully. "Am I to understand there is no argument between you gentlemen?" "None at all," Tupac smiled. "I was only discussing a book with Tristan here. We seem to share an appreciation for Alvareno's dosages." "Indeed?" Angharade pressed, suspicious. There was something familiar about the Aslan's polite manner. "Master Tupac was requesting medicine for a friend," Tristan added. "It is my pleasure to help the brave souls that fought above." Suspicion lingered, but the Sacramontan looked to be speaking honestly. The dark-haired man knelt to open his cabinet, revealing some sort of intricate medicine box within. Taking out 2 small vials, one half full and the other empty, he palmed a fat syringe and began to extract from the full. "You'll need to dilute it with water," he informed Tupac, "else your friend Leander will fall into stupor. 2 measures, preferably." The Aztlan nodded. "Leander fought with us earlier," the pale-eyed man told Angharad. "His arm was wounded when his sign was broken by the saint." Galatas, Angharad deduced, must have been the gaunt man's surname. "Is he not in the doctor's care?" she asked, surprised. "The doctor won't be following us on the island, Mulaney," the big man grunted. "Do you think the arm's going to grow back?" The Aztlan was leering at her most unpleasantly, but she must admit he had a point. "The stump will be tended to and cleaned, but something will be needed for the pain when we journey across the island," Tupac said. "You have my thanks, Tristan." The gray-eyed man smiled widely and happily. What a kind soul, Angharad thought. He must be a physician's apprentice to take such joy in helping others. He did have a meticulous air to the way he moved, as if measuring every gesture. "The honor is mine, Master Tupac," the Sacramontan replied, then rose to his feet. His clothes, though clean, were shabby. The edge of his shirt was touched with ichor, a sign he had not been helpless in the fight. "I should go see if the surgeon's stocks are running low with anything," Tristan said. "With so many wounded it is a distinct possibility." "Praiseworthy," Angharad replied, impressed. "Indeed," Tupac smilingly agreed. The gray-eyed man took his leave, taking his medicine cabinet with him, and Angharad's eyes turned to the lingering pair of Aztlans. As she had suspected, they still had business with her. One of them, anyway. The large man with the broken nose and the garish tattoos she dismissed, for all the muscle in the world would not change that he held himself with fear of Tupac's sickle. Said man, she realized after taking a longer look, seemed somehow unnatural. His skin was without a single blemish, his face and limbs perfectly proportioned. It was as if some Tianxi artist had drawn a man rather than anything born of a woman's womb. Yet it was the eyes that unsettled her most, pale things that they were. "I am impressed," Tupac plainly said, "by the way you handled the saint." "I could not have slain her without aid," Angharad replied. "Neither could most on this ship, blast cloaks or not," Tupac said. "It does not matter. The fight let me take the measure of you, Lady Tredegar, and I am pleased with what I saw." The noblewoman did not smile, did not thank him or answer at all. She recalled, now, why Tupac's pleasant demeanor felt familiar. She had known a girl, once, whose father had been a lord of the court at the feet of the High Queen. He had been smiling and polite and the soul of courtesy, the sole instance Angharad met him, yet somehow she had known that his smile would not waver even if he had to order the death of everyone in the room. Tupac was the same, measuring those around him for usefulness and dismissing those that were not. Cold eyes, cold blood, Angharad thought. She knew a snake when she saw one, and Tupac's sickle was only biding his time until the bite. "I have been gathering comrades for the trials," the Aztlan elaborated, impatient of her silence. "Leander fought in part to prove worthy of this company, which I intend to be without dead weight. I would be pleased to have you join our number, Lady Tredegar." "I thank you," Angharad said, "but I have already found companions." "The Infanzones have already lost one of their sworn swords," Tupac told her, "and they will find the trials more perilous than they think. I urge you to reconsider." Angharad met the man's pale eyes, face a blank mask. She thought of the sound her blade had made, near the docks, when it had opened the Red Cloak's throat. Of the wet, dying gurgle that it hissed out. She held the death close in her mind and then smiled. "I thank you," Angharad evenly repeated, "but I have already found companions." Tupac drew back half an inch before stopping himself. Pleasantness fell from his face in patches, like cheap cosmetics in sweat, and he gave her a long look. "Unfortunate," Tupac's sickle finally said. "I will not make this offer again." He inclined his head politely. "We will meet again, Lady Tredegar." "Of that," Angharad softly replied, "I have no doubt." She watched the pair leave, and when exhaustion began to creep back decided that she would have to find somewhere with her back to the wall to sleep. She had a feeling a knife might just sprout there otherwise. The last leg of the trip to the island of Villa Perdida, also known as the Dominion of Lost Things, was not restful. The watch crew cleared out the last of the mantics hiding in the hold before summary repairs were made and sails raised again. The Bluebell was limping where it had once run, but they were assured by the captain that it would only make a difference of hours and they would not be greatly hampered in their taking of the trials. Angharad shared her misgivings about Tupac Sickle with her fellow nobles and found them taken seriously even by the Sheridan brothers, who had somewhat warmed to her since the fighting. They were not unaware that their reputation had sunk in the aftermath and were taking pains to be polite, though sometimes their unpleasantness still slipped out. The Infanzones sought out helpers of their own, among which Angharad was pleased to count Tristan. A physician, even a middling one, would be of great help on the island. She herself did not have much time of her own, as her actions against the saint had lent her a degree of fame, and her company was in high demand, which seemed to please Isabel, who often sat with her as she entertained other passengers and took a long walk with her on the deck. A watchman approached them at the end of the last, the sailor informing them that they were soon to be in sight of the Dominion. "I must see to my affairs, then," Isabel mused. "Angharad?" "Go ahead," she replied. "I want to look at this island before we touch the shore." "How quickly you leave me," Isabel pouted, but it was nothing but teasing. The Perdura leaned against the railing, her mended coat making the cool wine nothing but pleasant as she settled into wait. Her solitude was not to last, however, as she was approached by another passenger. Another woman, Aztlan and no older than 20. Pretty, Angharad thought, with full lips and dark eyes. "You must be the woman of the hour," she smiled, offering her hand. "I am your Etsy." "Lady Angharad Tredegar," she replied, taking it. The other woman's grip was firm and lingering. "I could not resist introducing myself, after hearing so much of your valor against the saint," your Etsy said. The talk that followed was light and pleasant. Angharad had never been one to disdain the admiration of a beautiful woman, especially one whose eyes were appraising her so frankly, but she knew she must cut this short. Setting her cap at another taking the trials was already somewhat foolish, but indulging in a flirtation with a second? That was courting trouble. Besides, what if Isabel saw and misunderstood? No, best cut this short indeed. Angharad was fairly sure, from the way your Etsy was staying so close and batting her eyes so coquettishly, that she was not misreading friendliness as interest. "I am told we are soon to arrive at the Dominion," Angharad slid into a lull of the conversation. "We should see to our affairs before then, I think." "Of course," Yaratais agreed. "We shall talk later, I think." The Aztlan woman smiled rather flirtatiously, offering a slight bow. "Should circumstances allow," Angharad mildly replied. Her solitude was returned to her just in time, for it was moments later that she first caught sight of the Dominion of Lost Things. The island was startling large, and though its hulking dark shape was touched with but little light, specks that must be the watch fortress and the docks, she could make out its silhouette. Lowlands leading up to a handful of slender mountains, thick woods peeking out on the sides. How long would it take to cross from one end to the other? At least a week, she thought. More intriguing were the hard angles she glimpsed jutting out of the plains and peaks, man-made structures. There must have been old ruins. Angharad stayed on the deck, eyes peeled on the island, until the Bluebell was close enough to signal the docks with lantern lights. Her fate awaited her on those shores and she would not fail to meet it. The stench was heavy on the wind. Before they even docked, before ropes were thrown and the cogs secured in that ragged harbor, Angharad knew what it was she was smelling. But she fought it all the way, trying to wrestle the knowledge down so it would disappear in some dark corner and never be seen again. The first thing she saw as she followed the others out onto the docks was the fires. A dozen of them, large as could be and burning bright. The smoke was thick and cloying, rising in tall columns as blast cloaks fed the flames with logs and charcoal. No one came to greet them as they crept out, the group hesitating for the absence, and the Bluebell's crew were of no help, They were busy unloading crates and had no time to spare for this sort of business. There should be others here, Augusto chaired and frowned. We are the second ship and the smaller one. Has the first wave already gone ahead and begun the trial? They have, Angharate thought. Sleeping God, they have. She knew the smell, the memory enough for sweat to trickle down her back as she remembered the screams. The bright bonfire of everything and everyone she loved disappearing into smoke. We must ask, Isabel firmly said. Before anyone could protest, she peeled ahead, maids trailing in her wake, and approached a bearded old man in a black cloak who was shoveling coal into a fire. She smiled sweetly at the watchman, curtsying as she gave her greetings. Amused, the blastcloak paused in his work. The captain will be here to speak to you in a bit, he said. Don't you worry your pretty little heads. That is good to know, Isabel said. But may I ask where those who came with the first ship have gone? The old blastcloak laughed, then pointed his shovel at the sprawl of fires. You're looking at them, girl. And Angharate finally looked horror in the eye. Allowed her gaze to stray among the flames where she made out limbs, the twisted shapes of broken and mutilated bodies. Faintly she heard the echo of screams long gone silent as the ghost of Lunhall burned on the wind. It's a bad year, the blastcloak shrugged. All 40 died on the first day. Chapter 7. People could be funny about death, Tristan thought. Dozens died in Sacramonte's gutters every day and no one batted an eye, but if you tossed 40 bodies on pyres and made people look at them suddenly, it was the greatest tragedy in the world. Watching Isabel Ruesta bawling her eyes out, the thief held back from rolling his own. Her admirers were already flocking to offer her sweet words of consolation, though he noticed they looked shaken too. That was the thing with nobles. They'd lived such pretty lives it never really sunk in that they were always just one mistake away from dying. They thought they were important, that the world should somehow care, but Tristan knew better. Your life only ever really mattered to yourself. I think she might truly be grieving, Fortuna said, peering over his shoulder. He snorted. Sure she is, he murmured. Her chance to marry her rich cousin just went up in smoke. Literally. Maybe one of the blastcloaks would be nice enough to help her pick out the right column. Keeping the amusement off his face, he flicked a glance backwards when footsteps creaked on ash-strewn mud. Young's black hair, tousled by warm breeze, was absent-mindedly pressed aside as the older man approached with a grimace. Thought I was done smelling this after leaving Tianxia, Young said, then spat to the side. It was a hellish sight, the thief thought, the burning red glow and thick smoke swirling around them. It was what he thought pandemonium might look like, that great monstrous city of devils in the Far East. All the evils in the world, kept sealed inside Hell's capital by the arms of the Watch. It had all felt very far away, once, but not so now that he left Sacramonte for this strange shore. Shivering despite the heat, the thief spoke to fill the silence. So you've been in wars, Tristan said. It's Tianxia, boy, Yang snorted. There's always a fucking war on. So the word went. The republics making up Tianxia were famous for their squabbles, be they mercantile or military. Only the rough business of driving out the imperial Someshware had ever succeeded at getting them to set aside their enmities for more than a season. Killed some folk, didn't get killed back, the Tianxi continued. As good as career as a soldier gets. His hand, Tristan saw, was inching towards the flask of drink in his coat pocket. It stopped when he noticed the thief's stare. Anyhow, Young brusquely said, they are burning the bodies naked. Means the equipment is still around here somewhere. Tristan inclined his head. I'll see what I can do. He didn't make promises, and the former soldier didn't ask for any. Neither was fool enough to think getting caught stealing from the Watch would end in anything but summary execution. The show of sorrow was coming to an end. Besides, Isabel Ruesta sniffling as her admirers swore she would be safe, and her maids wiped her cheeks with soft handkerchiefs. Tristan saw most of the others were still milling about uncertainly, waiting among the ashes of the dead for a welcome that had yet to arrive. There were only a few blastcloaks tending to the pyres, and they cared little for talk, while no one had quite dared approach those standing near a set of storehouses further up the beach. A few enterprising souls shook the surprise before the rest, though. Ju and Lan, who had failed to secure a place in Tupac-Sickle's crew despite heavy courting, were looking around for something. Either the rest of the Blast Cloaks, Tristan counted only a dozen, way too few for an outpost this large, or the same potential Luke Young had sniffed out. They earned unfriendly looks from the watchmen standing guard when they tried to casually approach the storehouses, almost making the thief smile. They might have been rats of a finer coat than he, but to the watch they were rats still. Counting that situation as in hand, he moved out through the smoke. In passing he found Tupac-Sickle and his little band standing unusually close to a pier, hiding one of them from sight with their bodies. The asphodel noble with the acne, a Cainthy something or other. Tristan watched them carefully, trying to make out what they were doing, but did not dare linger when he was seen. The Aslan had shaken him down for painkillers on the boat, having recognized the box Tristan had stolen from Alvareno's dosages. The implied threat of having it revealed that he was going around carrying a poisoner's kit had been enough for Tristan to pay up, but the matter was not finished. People who twisted your arm for payment always came calling again. That crew was too dangerous to tangle with for now, but who knew how the trials would go? Patience was the key to many a lock. The thief edged around the fires, taking a longer look around as the rest of the people began spreading out in their impatience. The watch's foothold on the island was no great fortress, only a couple of long stone storehouses that must have served as both storage and dormitories. Old lamplights cast a dim glow all around, the dirty lanterns hanging off them burning cheap oil. There was a sloping watchtower past the storehouses that overlooked the bay, the muzzle of 3 cannons peeking out from its top, but aside from these there was little here but docks, piers and a muddy beach. The docks weren't even much to talk about, just a stretch of half-rotten wood jutting out into the water. Only 2 ships the size of the Bluebell would have been able to dock at the same time, and only one to unload. Sailors were now bringing out crates from the cog's belly, moving them towards the storehouses, and it was plain there would not have been room for a second crew to do the same. Instinct nagging away at him, the thief drifted closer to have a look at the crates being moved, though not close enough to earn suspicion. "We've seen that crate before," Fortuna suddenly pointed out. He knew exactly which one she meant. The same crate the poor girl who'd turned into a saint had tossed him into when she came out swinging, spilling seeds everywhere. It had only been roughly fixed, tarp nailed onto wood to prevent further spills, and so had a distinctive look. As far as he could tell, most of the crates being taken out were from the same part of the hold, and that had him curious. The watch was bringing out cheap seeds, the kind from plants not grown in glare light, and so carrying none of that light within them. None but darklings and the poor ate anything made of that unless they had a choice. "It can't be meant for the Blast Cloaks," he muttered. "There's no natural glare on the island, only the lights they brought. They should be eating only proper food to stave off gloam sickness, not this shit." "They took out those boxes full of trinkets too," Fortuna noted. And yet, as far as he could tell, none of the crates that had held muskets, black powder or military rations. This place was not, he deduced, truly the seat of the watch garrison on the island. Only an outpost used to herd those who took the yearly trials. That and one more thing. His thoughts were interrupted by another's approach, and there was no mistaking whose. Sare, clad in the grey dress and veils that hid her from head to toe, was unlike anyone else come out of the Bluebell. Tristan did not move away when she came to stand by his side, as their last trade had been profitable to both. He was not averse to continuing the relation. "I believe you're the only other to have come looking at the crates," Sare said. Those smiling twins came close, but only looking for grave goods. The thief snorted. "No point in that," he told her. "Either the Blast Cloaks will let us help ourselves openly, or now's the worst time to be trying." If there was anything he and Young decided they absolutely needed, he'd wait until there were fewer people around to steal it. Practical, Sare approved. "But what has you looking at the crates?" he hummed, not turning to meet the copper mask around her eyes. It would give him nothing. "What has you doing the same?" Tristan retorted. "We've been told that Captain Christine is only a few minutes out," Sare easily said. "I came to warn you. half a lie. She was counting the crates too, the thief had noticed. But it had been useful what she said, so he gave a little too. "This isn't where the real watch garrison is posted," he said. "Crates full of arms and rations are still in the cog. They must have a fort elsewhere on the coast the Bluebell will be sailing for." It was hard to tell, with the veils, but he thought she might have smiled. The sailors chattered about a town called Three Pines back on the ship, the other cheered. "This can't be it, so we are in agreement." He nodded. The two of them stood there, counting the crates, for a long stretch of silence. Only when it became clear the sailors would take nothing else out of the cog was Sarah stirred to speak again. "You must have figured out what this place is really about," she finally said. Tristan weighed his options. If she was counting, then so had she. There was not much to lose by speaking his mind. "It's a trade post," the thief said. "Or something like it. Crates of black seeds and trinkets? There's darklings here on the island and the watch trades with them." "Trinkets," Sarah slowly said, as if trying out the word. "Yes, that is a good way to call them. Glass and mirrors and kettles." He glanced her way, but there was no reading the woman beneath the veils. "The Milani love to use trinkets up north," she said. "They bribe lowland kings with them to win rights to slaves and copper. They'll trade the kings everything out of Milan, really, save for the one thing the Blastcloaks aren't trading here either. Muskets," Tristan quietly said. "That is so," Sarah agreed, the faintest touch of a strange accent touching her voice, then turned his way. "I counted 14 crates. You?" "The same." "Then we know there are hundreds. Likely more than 1,000? Tristan grimly nodded. "Seeds didn't keep forever and, if 14 crates of them were to be sown soon, then there must be enough darklings on the island to sow them." That was troubling, even though Tristan was no sneering redeemer to believe all darklings at best a step removed from beasts. He had rubbed elbows with their kind in the worst of the city's slums, near the old mines where many dwelled. Tristan had found them a strange folk, but not so different from other men. Yet here the watch was taking great care to keep muskets out of their hands, and that was a telling thing. "Has to be cults," the thief said. "The old stories say that the island's called the Dominion of Lost Things because the watch throws away all sorts of old evils on these shores to be lost forever." "Cults would be a greater concern than simple lemures," Sarah replied. "They'll go out of their way to hunt us." Darklings who worshipped the bloody-handed gods of the old night were rightly feared by all civilized peoples of Vesper, as their cults sought a great many things but blood was always one of them. "There's a reason only fools and the desperate take these trials," Tristan said. She turned to shoot him a look which, even under the veil, he could tell was amused. "And which are you, Tristan?" He offered her a winning smile. "You underestimate me, Sarah," he drawled. "I might lay claim to both." She cocked her head to the side. "That act you put on is surprisingly charming," Sarah said. "It must have taken you years to polish." Surprise stole the words out of his mouth. His belly clenched in discomfort as Fortuna guffawed, leaning against his shoulder. "Oh, we should keep that one," the goddess decided. "Make it happen, Tristan." He was saved from answering by a ruckus in the distance, as he'd been forewarned. Captain Christina was returning. They parted without another word, Sarah's lash still hanging in the air between them, and he drifted through the columns of smoke. Young joined him halfway, the two of them following the press of trial-takers gathering as the Blastcloaks rode in. The watchmen numbered a dozen, all riding sure-footed Abrian ponies and armed to the teeth. Wrapped in a heavy back cloaks that had earned the watch its oldest sobriquet, they carried muskets, sabers and paired pistols with powder gourds hanging off their saddles. "They look ready to fight a war," Young muttered, and Tristan could only agree. A rider guided her mount away from the rest, barking out an order that saw half the company heading towards the storehouses while she pulled down a black scarf to reveal the tanned features and curly hair of a barn Sacramontan. Reining in her panting horse, she cast a look that was halfway to a glare at the crowd before spinning to the side. The Infanzones wrinkled their noses as the sight almost as one. The thief, on the other hand, grew wary. He could almost smell the anger boiling under that still calm facade. "Welcome to the Dominion of Lost Things," the Blastcloak announced. "I am Captain Christina Elver, the officer appointed to command of this outpost by grace of the Conclave. You may refer to me as either Captain or Ma'am." Tristan knew little of the Watch's workings, for the Order delighted in secrecy, but the difference between the Conclave and the Free Companies was common knowledge. If the companies were the branches of the tree, largely independent armies and fleets roaming Vesper to take contracts as they would, then the Conclave was the trunk. It ruled the Watch's fortresses, ran its tribunals and conducted its diplomacy. Captain Christina, if she had been appointed by it, was not answerable to anyone else. It was a veiled warning to any noble who might think to make demands of her, Tristan figured. By the silence that followed her words it had duly been heard. "You will have heard by now that the first wave of trial-takers met misfortune," Captain Christina said. "I can confirm that all 40 of them are dead." No sobs followed, not even out of Ruesta, but a great deal of unease spread. Tristan shared in it. "May I ask what happened to them, Captain?" one of the Infanzones called out. "Lady Vilazar," he noted. Of the Sacramontan nobles, she most seemed to be taking the dangers seriously. They decided to set out early and were ambushed by cultists of the Red Eye about half a day from here, the watchwoman plainly said. "Some would have made it, if the fighting hadn't woken up an Aravadan." That didn't get much a reaction out of anyone except the Ramayans, whose faces betrayed fear and surprise. Noticing the confusion of most of the crowd, the captain elaborated. "A Heliodoran beast," she said, and it got gasps. Abuela had made him read several books on Lars Lemures, most of them about the creatures native to the shores of the Trebian Sea, but Heliodoran beasts had come up in one of the more fantastical works. More common in the Imperial Someshware, Tristan recalled. They could grow large as houses if they were old enough. He had never seen a drawing, but they were said to be horned creatures possessed of many eyes and great strength. "It killed most everyone and wandered off after chewing on a few corpses," Captain Christina said. "The good news for you lot is that with a full belly it won't be on the prowl for more. It might even have gone back to sleep by." "And the bad news?" Tupac Sickle asked. "The Red Eye cult is all riled up, boy," she replied. "They lost near a full war band and brought back no sacrifices to show for it. They'll be out in force looking to make up for that. My men and I just cleared their scouts all the way to the high road, but from here on out you're on your own." Then she looked viciously amused. "Of course, there's now a graveyard's worth of blood spilled on the road north," Captain Christina added. "So if I were you I'd first worry about the scavengers that will draw out." The brutal mixture of honesty and disregard hit the most fearful among them hard. Ains, the terrible gambler he'd met in passing, looked about to break down weeping, and her husband was little better. The old woman with the spectacles, Vanessa, had a resigned look about her. Like she had not expected to live through this in the first place and had just got that fate confirmed. Even a few of the recommended foreigners looked wary. Whatever good cheer had been won by the victory on the ship was returned to the other. The asphodel noble with acne cleared her throat loudly. "We were told." "I don't care what you were told," Captain Christina sharply interrupted. "I've lost half my command cleaning up the mess the first pack of idiots made, and I'm not going to bleed the rest holding your hands. You have from me all you'll get, in your till." She spat to the side again, eyes glittering with anger. "You get the rules? You get to take from the supplies, and then you'll all be getting the fuck out of my outpost before the hour's out." The Blastcloak mastered her temper, lowering the voice that had begun to rise with the end of her sentence. "Lieutenant Sehel, take them through the rest," she called out. "I have letters to write to the families of men who deserve better." A rider from the handful that had been standing behind her came forward, taking off a wide-brimmed hat to reveal a dark Mulaney face. The man smiled, lamplight glittering on a silver tooth as he did. "Yes ma'am," he agreed. Captain Christina rode away, face twisted in anger, and her lieutenant turned to the crowd with brisk mannerisms. "There are 3 trials," Lieutenant Sehel announced. "The first is Trial of Lines, which you are soon to begin. To find the others is simple. There is a road beginning half a mile ahead, and you simply need to follow it across the island. Through thick woods that could be seen in the distance, Tristan noted, and then tall mountains much further ahead. No doubt through cultist ambushes and hungry lemurs as well. At the end of every trial, before the next, you will find sanctuaries marked by yellow lamps, and entering them means you have succeeded, the lieutenant continued, sounding almost bored. Neither beasts nor cultists will do harm within these sanctuaries, and their officers will offer you the opportunity to end your candidature. He paused. Should you choose this, you will enter the protection of the watch and be escorted to our garrison, where you will await the end of the trials before sailing back to Sacramonte. This was not news, not exactly, though Tristan had not known the practical details. Infanzones always quit after the second trial, lest they win the reward of being inducted into an order that required one to renounce their titles. This was a proving ground for them, not a vocation's choosing. Apologies, sir, Angharade Tredegar spoke up, but you have forgot to mention the rules. The lieutenant frowned at her. What rules? She blinked. Surely there must be rules of conduct between us, the Perduri said. Lest the trial descend into squabbles and backbiting. Tristan swallowed his smile. Gods. She hadn't quite got what this first trial was about, had she? It wasn't called the Trial of the Lines because the road ahead was straight. It was about the lines you were willing to cross to survive. The thief couldn't muster up resentment for it, though, or even much mockery. Tredegar seemed to largely mean well, much as when she had come to save him from Tupac Sickle. She was of that particular breed of noble who thought they benevolent saviors, never mind that they usually had no idea what the people they were trying to help wanted or needed. Still, she was cut of better cloth than the like of the Cherdans, so he took no joy from Lieutenant Seahull laughing in her face. This isn't that kind of a place, girl, the watchman said. You're not allowed to kill each other here or inside the sanctuaries, but beyond that? The lieutenant shrugged. Survival is the rule. The rest isn't the watch's concern. Tredegar took it better than he'd expected, shutting her mouth and slowly nodding. Maybe not as soft as I thought, Tristan considered. He supposed that becoming a mirror dancer must beat some squeamishness out of you, if it was actually anything like what Sarah had described. Considering that the sailors, many of them veteran watchmen, had sounded awestruck when describing her scrap with a saint, Tristan was inclined to believe it. Someone asked about the supplies Captain Christina had mentioned and the lieutenant agreed to lead them to the goods without much prodding. What they found when led there was better than he'd expected, finally an upside. There were 3 crates of miners' rations, dried meat and sorted bread with nuts and berries, all neatly wrapped in packs. Besides them were crates of cheap water skins, bedrolls, lanterns and fire starters. All were invited to help themselves, courtesy of the watch, though many refrained as they had better equipment already. Tristan did not, but because others did he felt comfortable going straight to the 3 sprawling piles besides the crates with no fear of being left without supplies. There the watchmen had dumped the equipment of the deceased, separating them into 3 broad categories: weapons, clothes and the rest. Lieutenant Seahull left them to it after a last reminder they were to be gone by the end of the hour. A semblance of order formed around the crates, begun by Angharade Tredegar lining up behind a surprised Vanessa. Those that would have elbowed the old woman aside without a second thought did not dare to pick a fight with the Perduri, ensuring temporary civility as others lined up, but Tristan spared the affair no more than a glance. His fellow rats were coming for the grave goods and there would be no courtesy to be had there. Jew and Lan were already sniffing around the weapons, O'Cotlan the leg-breaker elbowing one of the twins aside to grab a long-hafted axe no one else would have been able to use anyhow. Tristan grabbed a leather tricorn in the Mulaney style out of the clothes pile and set it on his head before joining the fray, just as Bron and the married pair, Ains and Phyllis, began looking too. Most of it was useless to him, swords he did not know how to use or hunting spears, but he grabbed a hunting knife to serve should his own blade break. The dozen muskets lined up were useless to him as well, but the pistols warranted a second look. The thief had little training with the weapons, for Abuela considered them loud and imprecise, but he knew basics. And from close enough a pistol was hard to miss with. Best to have it and not need it than the other way around, he decided. He grabbed a wooden powder flask from the pile and began rifling through the pile of pistols, stilling when he came across a familiar sight. As far as arms went, it straddled the line between decorative and practical, engraved with wolves chasing each other's tails, while a tassel hung off the bottom bearing an encrusted red gem. The cold metal of the barrel, though, was functional and without frills. Tristan's mother had owned a pistol much like this, once, though her own Rosani relic had preferred foxes to wolves. Breaking out of his stupor, Ju's fingers closed around the pistol and she shot him a sly blue grin. "Too slow, rat," she chided, and flicked a finger against the gem. It rang prettily. Not too pure a ruby, but still worth a tidy sum, Ju decided. She had no idea what the relic was really worth, then. Tristan could have told her he'd seen it first, but the claim would have meant nothing to either of them, so he didn't bother. "Give it here," he said instead. The man girl frowned, reading his face and then taking half a step back. "Help yourself to another," Ju said. "Plenty left." Tristan's hand slid towards the blackjack at his side, not quite subtly enough for her to fail noticing it. "Last warning," the thief said. From the corner of his eye he saw they'd drawn some attention, so it was too late for either of them to back out. Whoever did would be marked as easy meat for anyone that felt like throwing their weight around. Ju flicked a glance behind him, seeing something that strengthened her resolve, and sneered. "You wouldn't dare." He aimed the blow for the side of her mouth, hard enough it'd hurt but not knock teeth out. Ju yelped in pain as she stumbled onto the ground, cradling her cheek, and Tristan pivoted out of the way. He moved out of the path of the swing he'd expected. Seeing his attacker's face, Lan had grabbed a musket and tried to smash it into his back like a mace, but she was no trained scrapper and it had gone well wide. The thief took a quick step forward, resting the side of the blackjack's leather strap against her neck before she could recover. Lan went still. "From here on out I go for crippling blows," Tristan evenly said. "Ju, give me the pistol." The spectacle drew scavengers. Broken-nosed O'Cotlin, interest caught by the violence, approached with an expectant air. He was looking at the relic pistol as well, likely wondering what was worth the scrap there and whether he should try his hand at taking it. Tristan schooled his face not to reveal he'd seen Young silently moved behind the big man, a hand on the hilt of his sword. Bronn stepped close as well, eyes watching them all closely with that perennial calm smile. That one worried him more than the big Estlin, if only because he was much harder to read. "They won't let you get away with it," Lan said, but her voice was shaking. Tristan's jaw clenched. He'd already given as many warnings as he cared to, offer too many of those and people stopped taking you seriously. His arm tensed as he drew back for another blow, but the sisters gave first. Ju threw the pistol at his ankles, just strong enough for it to sting. "There," she spat. "Choke on it." He gave Lan a warning look and the other sister took a step back, grimacing, as he bent to pick up the relic. His eyes were already moving on to O'Cotlin, who looked like he'd come to a decision. That nasty grin heralded nothing good, but the big man was too late. Angharad Tredegar, wearing that coat ever in need of mending, strode boldly onto the scene, and Tristan almost smiled because it had been about time. Now that the scavengers had clawed at each other, their benevolent savior would naturally come to restore order. "What is going on here?" the dark-skinned noble demanded. And there went O'Cotlin's smile. He would be under orders by Tupac to avoid tangling with the mirror dancer, Tristan figured. A practical sort of bastard, Tupac Sickle. Unfortunately not the kind of man who could be counted on to get himself killed on his own. "An argument over goods," Tristan said. "It has ended." Tredegar glanced at the blackjack still in his hand with surprise and some distaste. Ju had, of course, elected to remain on the ground and was now cradling her cheek like he'd struck her twice as hard as he actually had. Betting on the Perduri getting the relic back for her, was she? Unfortunately for her, Tristan knew exactly how to deal with the likes of Angharad Tredegar. Having given his answer, he turned and walked away. Not in another direction, for that would have smacked of retreat, but instead past the noblewoman. She was half expecting a confrontation. It was writ in her stance, But the thief instead said nothing and continued past her before she could recover from the surprise and try to interrogate him again. Even if the twins went whining to her now, what would Tredegar do, shake him down for the pistol in front of everyone? That wasn't the kind of person she thought she was. She'd stepped in to save someone, not serve as leg breaker for a pair of sisters who were more than a little bit suspicious. The Perdiri wouldn't like it, but the matter was good as finished. The thief was aware he'd soured the first impression he had made on a dangerous woman and crossed another too, but he was still smiling as he moved towards the back of the line for the rations. Yang came to stand behind him to wait, as if by coincidence. "So what was worth the mess?" the soldier asked, voice slightly slurred. "Drinking again." It hadn't taken long. Tristan ripped the string keeping the tassel tied to the bottom of the relic, shoving it into his pocket after. Angling the pistol so that only he and Yang would see, he then pressed his thumb against one of the walls. There was a slight click and panel popped open, revealing a small stone no larger than thumbnail. It gave a soft, pale glow that the thief allowed to be glimpsed for only a heartbeat before sliding the wolf panel closed again. "Rhodamanthan quartz," Yang whispered, startlement sobering him up in an instant. Found only within the city-state of Razin's famous quarries, the precious stone was worth a fortune. Rhodamanthan quartz held the glare as few other materials did, almost day to day, a year soaking in the light meant about a year holding it. The piece in the relic pistol Mother had owned had gone inert, lessening its value. Once it lost the first light for good, the stone was said to begin holding it less and less, but it had still been pawned for enough the two of them to live on it for years. "No gloam disease for us," Tristan said, not hiding his satisfaction. "Even if the lights go out, keeping it against their skin for a few hours a day would keep the sickness from coming upon them until the stone died." Razani families considered the relics to be heirlooms, passing down from parents to children and treasuring them greatly. The rarity of their sale only made them more precious. "Worth the enemies," Young agreed. There was no more excitement as the trial takers claimed their supplies, the mood somber now that Tristan's actions had laid bare an ugly truth. Survival was more important to everyone here than civility. That did not mean all were eager to go off on their own, though. If anything, the corpses still burning on the pyres were a stark warning as to the risks of that approach. When the handful came together in conversation away from the rest, Tristan immediately saw the writing on the wall. Who they were spoke loud as to what would follow: Fernando Vilazar and Augusto Cherton for the Infanzones, Tupac Sickle for his own band, and Griseldiniani for the two pairs of youngsters with her. Every group with clout had a voice there, to an evident purpose. They all wanted to stick together for the early part of the trial of lines. That it would happen was good as a foregone conclusion. Everyone wanted numbers until they were certain there was no red-eye ambush waiting along the road or large roving packs of lemures. Once everyone was further in, people would begin turning on each other again, but for now all would prefer safety over seeking an edge. Tristan dismissed the talks from his mind, seeking instead the company of the other ally he'd struck a bargain with. Both of Isabel Ruesta's handmaidens had changed out of their dresses into more practical trousers and jackets for the walk ahead. Beatrice were visibly shoddier than Brisida's. Tristan figured that, unlike the drapier's daughter, his fellow rat had not had a coin to put on getting clothes she might never wear again tailored. She was also the one checking on the bags one last time before departure, Brisida instead attending to their mistress, but the thief was glad of that much. It was easier to approach her than if she were close to the Infanzona, who Tredegar and the younger Cherton were circling like bees with a flower. And largely for the same reasons, as far as Tristan could tell. He made no effort to hide his approach, and though he stopped well short of being in reaching distance of the bags, Beatrice still turned to glance at him. Brushing back dark hair, she scowled. "That showed your reputation good," Beatrice informed him. "If not for your medicine cabinet, they might have thought twice about bringing you along. But they haven't changed their minds," Tristan pressed. She shook her head. Good. That had been his worry, that if Tredegar would try to oust him. His bet had been that the Chertons would oppose her out of pure dislike, and it was good to see it had paid off. "I have work," Beatrice told him. "I must get back to it." He pushed down a frown. She had never asked if he'd gotten Ricardo killed, and he'd not offered up the truth of it, but since that day she had kept a distance. She'd not turned on him, remaining friendly, but she knew he was dangerous now, capable of killing and keeping it quiet. And so Beatrice, sensibly enough, seemed to have decided he was someone best kept at arm's length. Tristan would have preferred to keep on better terms, but if their relations were to take a cooler tone he would adapt. Casting a quick look around to ensure no one was watching, he reached in his pocket for the jewel-encrusted tassel and tossed it at her. Beatrice fumbled the catch, but picked it up from the floor quickly enough, surprise painted on her face. She turned a questioning look on him. "I have no use for it where I'm headed," Tristan shrugged. Whether that be the grave or the watch, a small ruby would do him no good. For her, however, it might just represent a turning point in her life. With the coin pawning this would earn her, it was no longer certain she must stay in the service of House Ruesta for the rest of her life. Beatrice bit her lip before nodding, putting away the gem before anyone could see her taking it. "This is a trade," the thief reminded her. "I scratch your back." The dark-haired woman shook her head. "I know how this goes," she replied. "I'll keep an ear out for anything of interest to you." The gray-eyed man dipped his head in thanks, troubling her no further. She still had work to do, and it wasn't like the nobles would deign to carry their own supplies. It took another quarter-hour for the informal council to finish, but his prediction proved accurate. A pact was struck and protection offered for those who would obey some simple rules. All were to pitch in for the group's protection as they marched. A roster would be made for keeping watch when camp was made, and so long as one joined the company there would be no violence against each other. Only a fool would have refused the terms, so no one did. They hurried after that, Captain Christina's demand they begun by the hour's turn, not something anyone cared to test. Onto the stairs of the blast cloaks the 31 of them settled into a thick marching column, bristling with lamps, and a lumbering march forward began. Behind them the lanterns of the watch grew distant, darkness hemming them in from all sides, and the trial of lines began. Chapter 8. Lieutenant Seal had said the road began half a mile ahead, and that was where they found it. Tristan was no tracker, not so far from dirty alleyways, but though the ancient paving stones were half covered by dirt and dead leaves, they were too large to be missed by anyone with eyes. The woods were light on either side but grew thicker swiftly, leaving the impression of a path cleared thoroughly long ago and since left for the forest to reclaim year by year. Most fighters banded at the front and the back of the column, while those there were low expectations for, the two gray hairs, the twins, Ruesta and her maids, stood safely stashed in between as the company marched on. Young had been called to the front by virtue of having a musket and knowing how to use it, while Tristan was ordered to the back by the Cherdon brothers' unpleasant valet, Gascon. The richly mustachioed man had been open in his contempt, having a look about him the thief was not unfamiliar with. It cropped up sometimes in the personal servants of Infanzones, those few who'd gotten so used to the taste of boot on their tongue they'd begun to think they were part of the soul. Contempt the thief cared nothing for, but his choice of company at the back of the column was unfortunate. He shared the guard with Tupac Sickle and his two asphodel companions. Leander Galatas was still nursing his wound from the blue belt, the arm turned to pulp, now a thoroughly bandaged stump, and kept to a sullen silence. The asphodel rectorate noble, whose full name Tristan learned to be Acanthifos, was a rather chattier fellow. She asked of his origins, which he remained vague about, and shared of hers freely. House Foes was, she told him, one whose fortunes had not done well as merchants began their rise. The lack of opportunities afforded to a seventh child from an impoverished house, one whose unfortunate acne made unlikely to marry rich, had seen her seek a career with the watch. It's all Tianxia's fault, of course, Acanthi told him, patting his arm in her enthusiasm. Their traitors rile up the commons, starting all this talk of turning Asphodel into a republic allied to the Ten. Absurd. He tended to agree. It would hardly be the first time that Tianxi helped overthrow the nobles of a city-state in the Trebian Sea, but once so close to Sacramonte? He had his doubts. Tianxia already had troubles enough at home without borrowing some from the city's backyard. Still, He suspected that his own Republican sympathies would win him no friend here, so Tristan steered the conversation into safer waters. Talk of Sarre, who yet feigned to be from the hated rival city-state of Rizzen, was fertile ground. "You can't trust Rizzeni, Tristan," a Cainthi lectured him. "It is well known that they wear their veils to better hide the devils among their numbers. They frolic with their like and debauched rituals, hoping to gain dark powers." Having been just as reliably informed by a Rizzeni trader that Asphodelites were half-devils themselves, keeping hidden libraries of dark tomes used in unholy rituals to turn the winds against honest Rizzeni captains, the thief hid his amusement as best he could. "Oh," Tupac mused, "I'm sure Tristan has nothing to fear from our Rizzeni, lady foes. He's already beaten a woman today, why not another?" The thief did not react. It was not the first time the Aslan tossed a barb his way, but giving him nothing in return saw him grow bored and cease. Having to take the needling again and again was exhausting, but he was determined not give Tupac whatever it was he was after. Tristan let the conversation peter out again, saying nothing, and ignored Acanthi's sympathetic look. She had yet to object, for while she might be enjoying their conversation, it was Tupac's sickle she had thrown in her lot with. She'd not endanger that alliance for nobody. The thief kept to his own mind for a time, unsettled by the ring of darkness around them. In Sacromonte there was always light, however distant, but here there was nothing beyond the glow of the lanterns they carried. The watch's outpost by the shore was hidden by the tall trees, and the stars above seemed so distant, as if even the ancient wonders of the antediluvians were seen through a veil. It read that the islands of the Trebian Sea were among the most luminous of all Vesper, so how dark must the rest of the world be? He shivered at the thought. The thief had no watch, but bespectacled old Vanessa did, and when they halted where it made its way down the column, it had taken 3 hours and a half for them to reach the blood-soaked battlefield Captain Christina had spoken of. It was a great clearing that the road ran right through, an opening in the forest, or at least it had been. There was a gaping pit at the heart of it now. Even the ancient paving stones shattered, and dried blood spread everywhere in wild streaks. They approached slowly and carefully, swords and muskets out. Tristan carefully loaded his pistol, cramming in the powder and ball, until the shivering lantern lights made out great footprints in the earth. Each was as large as a great pillar and rounded, digging deep enough to hint at the crushing weight behind the legs. It was with relief that Tristan saw the tracks heading east, deeper into the forest. But the captain's warning proved prescient. As they passed around, the pit shapes darted out of the shadows cast by the broken grounds. Only a dozen, though the suddenness of the charge caused some startled screams. Shots rang out before Tristan could even see the beasts properly, 5 of them dead on the ground in an instant, that short Dramaean girl with the pistols down 2 in the same breath. Half the remainder fled, the rest charging madly as they howled. They were lupines, Tristan saw, lemures with the look of great wolfhounds that grew bona like stingers along their matted fur. Their teeth were too large and curved for dogs, or even wolves, and their eyes like pits of yellow sulfur. The 3 that charged, for all their swiftness, ran into fine killers at the ready. Inyani and Tredegar shot forward, blades flashing. A beast's head was hewn open and the other run right through. The third passed them, just in time for O'Cutlan's axe to nail to the ground. It went right through, like a hatchet for a melon, and pulp flew sickeningly. Tristan spared them no more thought, though, as more lemurs were circling the tree-line behind him. Only a few shapes slinking along the line of light cast by the lanterns, but the sight of them was enough to have him clutching his pistol tightly. One ran out suddenly, and not thinking twice he lowered the pistol and pulled the trigger. The flintlock sparked, but his wrist trembled and the shot went whizzing wide, the lupin darting back out of sight without ever have been in danger. Tupac's sickle snorted from behind him. "Best stick to the black jack, I think," the Aslan said. Tristan hid his embarrassment by looking away, pretending to watch the woods. "Not that these are worth fearing," Tupac continued. "Barely more than dogs. Lupines prefer long hunts, sickle," he replied, pleased to correct the other man. "They can smell a scent for several miles and have a natural endurance, so the packs like to hunt their prey to exhaustion before going for the kill. The Aslan's pale eyes crinkled with pleasure, and Tristan immediately knew he had made a mistake. "I wonder," Tupac idly said, "how it is that a Sacramonte gutter rat knows that." The thief swallowed a curse as Acanthi shot him an assessing look. The Aslan had been goading him all this time for a reaction, and now he had finally gotten it. Cutting his losses, he moved away from the two, and Tupac let him retreat with a pleasant smile. The skirmish was good as done anyhow, the lupines unwilling to risk another attack. They must have been blood mad to risk one on such a large group in the first place. The column moved away, word from the front coming that a good camping site awaited 2 hours ahead. The Lemures disappeared from the back as they left the clearing for the forest ahead, likely gone back to eat the corpses of their own. They would return, though, and so after another tiring stretch of march through the woods, it was with relief that Tristan saw the campsite that had been chosen. It was well situated, he must admit. The first stretch of forest behind them had come at an end, revealing long rolling plains stretching out for many miles ahead until another tree line began near what must be the foot of the looming mountains. To the northwest, the silhouette of the old aqueduct known as the High Road could be glimpsed in the weak starlight if you stood at the edge of the lanterns long enough. It was close, no more than an hour's march away. The camping site itself was maybe a quarter-hour away past the woods, two sloping hills with a slender cut between them. They had signs of regular use, with fire pits already dug and dried out latrines. Under the orders of the Infanzones, who acted as if they knew of the place already and likely did, it was an open secret the families kept records, a camp was raised. The fire pits were fed with wood and charcoal as two watches took places at the summit of the hills, which would give a broad view of the plains below. The nobles raised their tents near the fires and their followers put down bedrolls around them, everyone else radiating outwards around the hills. As one of the Infanzone's recruits, Tristan earned a place halfway down the western hill near young and Lady Vilazar's hired hand Sonali. The likes of the married pair and the two gray hairs had to settle for further down on either hill, the first to be dragged into the night should some Lemure or cultist slip past the vigilance of the watchers. It was no grimmer than the truth of the city he'd been born in, Tristan figured, only stripped of the usual varnish that allowed people to ignore it. Putting down his bedroll and medicine cabinet, the thief checked in with a Cherden valet for his time to keep watch and was sneeringly informed his turn was to be near morning, 5 hours past midnight. Inyani's nephew Zenzel, who he was to replace, would come to wake him. Pleased at the given time, for it meant he would get most of a night's sleep uninterrupted, Tristan bade good sleep to Young and flopped down tiredly on his bedroll. He was asleep within moments. "Tristan," Fortuna hissed. "Tristan, you need to wake up." His eyes struggled to open, sleep fighting to keep them closed. His entire body felt lazy, like he'd spent an afternoon napping, and though he could hear Fortuna he struggled to remember why he should care about what she said. "You idiot, the goddess cursed. Get up, someone's pinning a murder on you." Sheer surprise and anger tore through the veil he'd been wrapped in, eyes fluttering open as he woke. The fires crackled in the distance, everyone asleep around him, and the thief bit his lip so he would not snarl. That tiredness had not been natural. Someone had used a contract on him. Shifting in his bedroll, Tristan caught Fortuna's eyes. The goddess, red dress bunched around her as she knelt in the grass, looked every inch the unearthly creature in the flickering light of the flames. Hair and eyes of molten gold, he thought. "Who?" he murmured. "Couldn't see," she admitted. Their face was covered. "I'm pretty sure it's a man, though." Tristan grimaced. The goddess could not stray too far from him, rarely more than a room's length. She would not have been able to follow the stranger back to wherever they'd hidden. She wouldn't be able to name his enemy. First get out of the trap, he reminded himself. "Where?" His murmur was answered by Fortuna gesturing at his medicine cabinet. "Inside." Gods, how hard had he been hit by the contract not to wake while someone was going through his belongings a mere 2 feet away? "Keep watch," Tristan said, and went to have a look. It was difficult to unlatch the cabinet and crack it open without making a sound while laying down, but it was not his first time needing quiet fingers. At first glance nothing was amiss, but then Tristan saw them, a dagger, carefully inserted between two vials, and a rag pushed into a half-hidden nook. A bloody rag, his closer look revealed. He unfolded it, careful to get nothing on his fingers, and saw that an edge had been wiped clear of blood on the cloth. Just enough to get me hanged if they catch me with it, he thought. Whoever had done this had been careful not to make him look like a complete fool, clever enough to hide and wipe the knife, just not to get rid of the rag after. If he were to sell the story in place of his foe, Tristan decided, he'd say that the rag was only hidden until it could be cleanly disposed of in a fire. Quietly he folded the cloth anew and took the dagger, beginning to close the cabinet silently as he put his mind to work along his hands. Someone must be dead, otherwise a wound deep enough to bleed this much blood would have walked them. More importantly, whoever had killed them wanted him to take the fall for it. Had he made an enemy, or had he simply seemed like a good sort to leave behind for the noose? There was no denying that he'd been picked out in particular, with the way a contract had been used on him. Only, he thought, it could not only be him who'd been touched by power. There were watchers as well, and they would have noticed someone moving around, so they must have been subjected to the contract too. Unless they were in on it, he considered, but then discarded the thought. Tristan was simply not important enough to be conspired against. That did not mean, however, that trying to out the scheme would be wise. A rat with a blood-soaked rag and a corpse someone needed to answer for. Even if he was the one to make a ruckus in the middle of the night, there were decent odds he'd still end up the one hanged. If it was one of the nobles that had done it, they'd close ranks to bury him. Not worth the risk. That did not mean there was not a solution. Someone had done all the hard parts of pinning a murder, and there was no need to waste all that work when he could use it instead. Closing the cabinet, he rose onto his knees. He could only see one of the watchers from here, but the Ramayan girl, Shalini, if he recalled correctly, was utterly still. No shifting around, no stoking the flames, no looking anywhere but straight ahead. Calming his breathing, smoothing his thoughts into calm, the thief stole the knife and rag from the grass before crawling forward. Silently, as not to wake any of those sleeping near him. Moving up the hill, he paused only to grab a loose pebble and gauge the distance. A heartbeat later he threw the small stone near Shalini, waiting tensely as it bounced off a half-buried log. The noise would have been unmistakable, but she did not so much twitch. Still under the contract, then, just as he would be had Fortuna not shouted at him until he stirred. Good, that meant he had his opening. The crawl resumed until he was near the fires, where the tents of the Infanzones had been raised. He could not see within, but outside lay their closest servants. The Sheridan valet, Isabel Ruesta's maids. Beatrice was unharmed, a relief, but to his displeasure not Cosmo Flor. Counting the tents again, he concluded that the Sheridan brothers must be sharing one while Cosmo had claimed the other. It was too risky to try for a tent, he reluctantly admitted to himself. He'd have to lower his aim. The Sheridan valet, Gascon. The brothers were unlikely to start carrying their own bags even if the valet was cast out, which meant it would likely end up Cosmo's work for all his pretensions that he was the one really in charge. He'd be more tired, more vulnerable, more likely to give Tristan an opening. Planting the goods was not all that difficult. The rag he hid under a flat rock a few feet away from the sleeping valet, with just a end of the corner peeking out, and he slid the knife under the sleeping man's neatly folded jacket. As he began to withdraw he saw the red-headed maid suddenly turn in her bedroll, yawning as she pawed at her loose hair. Tristan breathed in sharply, preparing to borrow luck, but she never opened her eyes. He stayed still as a statue until her breath evened out, asleep again. Flushed from the scare, he crawled his way back down the hill and slipped hastily back into his bedroll. Unseen, he thought, but he could not be sure. There would be no telling for certain until morning came. Though the thief knew he would need the rest, it still took him all too long to fall back asleep. The second time, he woke to a scream. Putting on a show, Tristan reached for his knife and rose with a gasp. Yang was brandishing his sword, eyes wide open, and the both of them found a crowd gathering on the side of the eastern hill. The corpse was there, below where the asphodel pair had been sleeping, and he padded over on bare feet to have a look at the body. The moment he did, his breath caught in his throat and he knew why he'd been the one chosen to take the fall. It was one of the twins. Jew, he was fairly sure, the one he had struck yesterday. That was not, he grimly thought, a good look for him right now. It was her sister who'd found the corpse, and Lan was red-eyed and shaking. Old Vanessa gently took her by the arm, offering comfort, but the blue-lipped woman pushed her away. She rose to her feet, eyes moving to him out of all the crowd as she did, and Tristan's stomach clenched. Revenge was but a shout away for her. My sister, Lan croaked out, was murdered in the night. Her throat slit like some pig for slaughter. Tristan tensed as he forced himself not to squirm under her gaze, but then Lan's eyes moved away. Until we find who did it, she said, no one here is safe. Abject relief. An accusation would have been no proof, but sometimes it didn't take much to whip up a mob. And a mob was very much in the making here, by the looks on people's faces as the crowd swelled. There's no stream near here to wash, Inyani called out. Someone here will have blood on them. The scarred older woman, like her charges, had been sleeping just on the other side of the hill. She'd been one of the first to join the gathering throng. We have waterskins, Brun calmly pointed out. There is no need for a stream. The other Sacramontan had slept on the opposite side of the western hill, the infan zones between them, but still been one of the first to arrive after the scream. Already up, Tristan figured. By now long enough had passed for said infan zones to learn they had a mess on their hands, so like a pack of lupines they showed up all at once. Treading along, of course, having become the muscle for their crew more than she likely realized. Cold water won't wash out blood well, Raymond Cherden announced, tone certain. I can still inspect everyone for traces. And why is it, Zenzel asked with wary eyes, that you would be doing the inspecting? The other man blinked, as if it had never occurred to him he might be questioned. Watch your tongue, Mulaney, he bit back. You almost sound as if you were accusing an infanzon of. We are not in Sacramonte, Cherden, the chumpy-cheeked Ramayan called Ishan calmly interrupted. Posturing does you no good. Isabel Ruesta, looking like the very picture of anguish, stepped in between them. Tristan almost snorted, thinking she was laying it on a little thick. How most people who met her seemed not to notice never felt to surprise him, she wasn't that good an actress. Now is no time to turn on each other with wild accusations, Ruesta implored. What could Raymond have had to gain, even were he a man to murder? What did anyone here have to gain? Fernando Velazar bit out after her. It was a senseless thing. For all we know a cultist did this in the night. Her appeal for an outside enemy was swiftly ignored. There is one, Angharate Tredegar evenly said, who quarreled with the sisters yesterday. Fuck, the thief thought. And now came the price for yesterday. Eyes turned to him, a crowd's worth of them as near everyone had gathered around the corpse by now, but Tristan did not flinch. If he showed weakness they would devour him whole. We quarreled over a pistol which is still in my possession, Tristan replied. Would slitting her throat somehow make it even more mine, Tredegar? No one else of this company has done violence on another, the Perduri pressed. Who else is there? You are, he replied, trying to do me violence right now. At that she balked, long enough for someone else to speak up. If we throw accusations without proof, Sare said, any one of us could be the culprit. Lady Inyani and Lord Raymond are correct, we should look for evidence first. And a mere heartbeat after she stopped speaking, as if it had been timed, there was an exclamation of surprise. One coming from near the tents of the infan zones, which raised Tristan's spirits even as the Tianxi with the silver eyes, Song, flipped over the stone near the valet's bedroll and revealed the bloody cloth. Blood, Song announced. Too much for a simple cut. Tristan's eyes narrowed. Fortuna, leaning against shoulder lazily, hummed in agreement. Both of them were well acquainted with chance, and the timing had been more than simply fortunate. It reeked of collaboration, but what for? Had they been behind all of this? Tristan could not remember seeing the two women exchange more than few words since they'd come aboard the Blue Bell, and he'd sought enmity with neither of them. It seemed off for them to try to frame him for an equally senseless murder. The pieces didn't fit. Whatever the truth, he was immediately forgot. The crowd exploded in jeers and shouts at the revelation of the bloody cloth, Gascoigne loudly exclaiming he had nothing to do with this, but swiftly drowned out by a tide of indignation. Not even his masters could prevent his affairs from being searched, and chubby-cheeked Ice Han was the one to lift the jacket and reveal the planted knife. The Romain held it up triumphantly, and in the moment that followed, half the crowd looked willing to cut Gascoigne's throat themselves. That was where things took a turn. "What of it?" Augusto Cerdon called out, shouting down the accusations. "It is his knife, you fools. I gave it to him myself years ago. He merely forgot to put it away." "It is true," Raymond immediately agreed. "This is no proof at all, only nonsense. We all have knives. Where is the blood on the blade?" Tristan, just for a moment, considered the possibility that whoever had murdered John in the night had used another man's knife for it. Wondered at the foresight of the murderer. And then he set that absurd thought aside, considering the much simpler proposition that the Cerdons were covering for their valet in case some of the shit he was dragging in ended up splashing them. It wasn't enough, though, and by the looks on the brothers' faces they knew it. They were not in favor with the other people here, not after having hidden away during the fight on the Blue Bell. So Isabel Ruesta spoke up, eyes calm for all that her face looked troubled, and Tristan knew it was over. "Brasida," the noblewoman called out, "you have known Gascoigne for years. Is it true? Is the knife his own?" The red-headed maid smiled broadly. "It is, my lady," she said. "I swear it." That gave the others pause. Even if it were untrue, forcing the matter would now make this a much larger trouble than a single corpse. The Infanzones commanded the largest group and were obviously making common front, one that counted a troubled-looking Angharade Tredegar, that one-woman battalion. Meanwhile, who did Lan have backing her? Not a soul. Tristan saw that revelation sink into the surviving twin, the way she looked as if she had been struck. The impotent rage that twisted blue-tinted lips when she realized that no one would do a damn thing about her twin being killed in the night because no one cared enough. And that was when, naturally, Tupac Sickle decided to step in. "I do not care for this talk of knives," the Aslan dismissed, "but for this instead. How was it done?" A moment of surprise followed. The Tianxi's throat was cut, but there is little blood spray on the grass and it is even, the man continued. "She did not move. Who does not wake or struggle even as they are dying?" "Someone touched by a contract," Tristan encouraged. He'd be mocked if he suggested as much, but the Aslan was not someone they would laugh at. "Someone who was drugged," Tupac said instead. "And there is only one here who carries such substances." The eyes went back to him, the thief's blood going cold as the crowd's mood turned again. Even the gaze of the Infanzones, whose crew he was meant to be part of. Only he was on their mirror dancer's bad side, and he would be a scapegoat for this mess much less close to them than the Cerdon's own valet. If anything, they might just help bury him. "I have a bottle of soporific in my cabinet," Tristan slowly acknowledged, playing for time, "but it is quite full. I invite you to look if you doubt me." He could only hope that it actually was full. He had not checked every single bottle while on the Blue Bell, which now struck him as a grave oversight. "What point would there be?" Tupac asked. "You could have topped it off with water, the color is the same." "Then drink a mouthful," Tristan acidly replied, "and tell us if it feels diluted." He could tell, though, that he was losing the crowd. What else was there? What shovel could he use to dig himself out? "I carry half a dozen medicines that could be poisons, used in a malignant manner," Tristan said. "What need would I have for a knife? If someone plucked a life unseen in the middle of the night, it seems to me more like the work of a contract than that of a bottle. It could have been the Lord of the 13th Heaven as well, I suppose," Tupac drawled, "but he is very far and your soporific fortuitously close. Besides, who is to say you do not have a contract yourself?" The Aslan was enjoying this, the thief thought. He could see it in the man's pale eyes. "Speak up then, boy," Augusto Cerdon broke in, a man no older than Tristan. "Do you have a contract? What does it do?" And now came the Infanzones, bravely riding to the rescue of the only thing they cared about, their reputation. Tristan smiled. showing all his teeth. "Your own valet is caught with a bloody cloth and a knife," he said, "and yet I am the one answering questions. An interesting turn, Churton." He was teetering on the edge, and there was no telling which way it would go. Would anyone even speak for him, if the Infanzones decided that he must be arrested for the safety of all? He'd have to try the luck, God's damn it all. But even if it got him out of the immediate trouble, how much worse would it land him in? It wasn't him. Surprise caught his throat as silence spread over the hill, and he turned to look at the speaker, Lan herself, mouth set in a straight line as she met his eyes. "My sister and I spoke with him last night. We settled our affairs," the blue-lipped woman lead. "There was no longer enmity between us. This is mudslinging." No one would argue with it, he knew, not when it was her own sister that had been murdered, but already he was digging behind. Why? What did she gain by doing this? She had to know the murderer had good as gotten away with it already. What did she? Ah, Tristan thought. 2 steps ahead, are you? She'd already seen through how it would end after no one paid for the death and decided to put him in her debt instead of making him an enemy. Only catching up now, his stomach clenched. He was about to lose everything he'd maneuvered for. "She's right," Inyani snorted. "You'd bury your own mother to keep the dirt from touching your feet, Churton." "Fuck this," her nephew Zenzel spat. "This isn't going anywhere. Come on, Andy, we're going. If they want to protect the killer, it's on their heads." "Agreed," Ishan snorted, throwing the knife into the grass hard enough it sunk to the hilt. "We part ways here." There were some token protests by Ruesta about the need to stick together, but it was theater. She made no real attempt to mend fences, and within a quarter hour Inyani's group of 6 was leaving. Herself, the nephew and his lover, the 2 Remains and that Estlin called Uretsi, who sometimes tried to chat up Tredegar. She was a decent shot with a pistol, he'd seen yesterday, but nothing else of note. The group headed for the road north and no tears were shed at this first departure. Why would there be? As far as the Infanzones were concerned, they'd averted a mess that would have entangled all of them, and the groups had been meant to split later today anyhow. Tristan stayed quiet and out of the way, knowing he too had come dangerously close to burning his fingers with this whole affair. Tupac led his group away not long after, though not before making some smiling comments to the Infanzones about trust. Taking the 2 from Asphodel and Ocotlin, he headed east towards the woods. Watching the pale-eyed Estlin stroll away, the thief could shake the feeling that only one person this morn had gotten everything they were after, and their name was Tupac Sickle. After that there were only the Infanzones and the soon-to-be leftovers remaining, so Tristan knew exactly what lay ahead. What Lan had seen before he did. The nobles would want to save face, and there was only one way left for them to do that. As he packed his affairs, the thief closed his eyes and forced himself to look for an angle. All his work to get close to the Churton, to lay down the foundation of his revenge, was about to be undone, but there had to be something. There was always an angle. By the time Kozum came to fetch him, smiling all rueful like he cared in the slightest, Tristan still had nothing. It was like clawing at stone. Following the retainer, he found that the Infanzones, their servants and other recruits were already waiting. The thief had not even noticed Young being sent for, stuck inside his own mind. The youngest Churton, Raymond, began to yammer on, but Tristan only paid him half a mind. Something about how their valet could not be the killer, that he of course did not believe Tristan was the killer either, but who could know? His older brother gravely added that they could not possibly put Isabella at even the slightest risk. Surely Tristan understood. If this were Sacromonte, they would have simply dismissed him with a smack on the mouth, telling him to mind his betters, but here they had to go through this charade because they needed others to follow them. Tredegar, Brun, Song, Young. All useful hands, all people that needed to be reassured they wouldn't be thrown aside easily. A lie, but one the Infanzones did not want seen through too quickly. It gave him no pleasure to see them go through these contortions, not when there was nothing he could do about the ending. The older Churton droned on while Ruesta looked at him with limpid eyes, as if full of sympathy. For Dana Vilazar's open boredom was, at least, refreshingly honest. She wanted this over with as much as he did. It had already been decided he was to be cast out of their little group, lose his opportunity to get at Kozma and the Cherdans, and there was nothing in his hands that could hurt them. Nor did his allies, the thief stilled. Not allies, no. But there were enemies aplenty. Lupines who would be hunting them all, soon enough, and that could. But how to deliver it? His revelation was encroached on by Isabel Ruesta's voice. "I do not believe it either, I assure you," she told him. "And you came recommended to me by Beatrice, who I most dearly trust. If she speaks again for your character, I will insist you remain with us." Tristan stilled. The Cherdans looked surprised and angry while Tredegar looked resigned, which implied Ruesta might not be simply posing. What would she get out of this? After a heartbeat he decided she wanted him under her thumb. Someone who'd owe her a nut bucket doing the kind of things Tredegar wouldn't. The thief's eyes moved to Beatrice, and he saw the maid touch her jacket's pocket, the same one where she had stashed away the ruby he'd given her. He saw the calculation in her eyes and the answer she came to. He had already killed Ricardo, and now he came with too many enemies attached. "I do not know him deeply, my lady," Beatrice said. "I cannot truly speak to his character." She did not look away when he met her eyes, unashamed. As well she should be. Tristan was not angry, not really. How could he be, when just yesterday he had struck one of the twins for a relic pistol? This was nothing more than the law of rats, the same he lived by. Beatrice would do all she could to survive, as he would in her place. It would have been a hypocrite's game to claim anger here. Ruesta looked taken aback for a moment, then demurred to her maid. "I can only follow your words, of course," she said. Beatrice not playing along had clearly been unexpected, and Ruesta looked, amusingly enough, like she'd been the one who just got a knife in the back. He breathed in sharply. That idle thought, that detail, was the last piece Tristan had needed. All of it fell into place, and suddenly there was no longer a need to humor any of this. "I will put us all out of our misery," the thief said, "and simply take my leave before Lord Augusto begins another speech." "Thank you," Fernando Vilazar frankly said. He walked away, deciding not to risk a glance at Young. The thought was tempting to try and ruin his chances to ensure he was forced to stick by Tristan, but the Infanzones were unlikely to throw away a skilled soldier on the thief's behalf, and an unwilling ally could be as dangerous as an enemy anyhow. Instead he made straight for his medicine cabinet, discreetly reaching for a small green vial near the middle compartments while pretending to be arranging the vials. Yes, lodestone extract was there just as the drawing in Alvareño's dosages outline. A shadow was cast over him in lantern light, Tristan looking up to find Young standing there. "I did not expect a courtesy goodbye," Tristan admitted. "I wish you good luck on the road, Young." He hesitated, wondering whether he should offer a warning and how to phrase it so his scheme would not be threatened. "I would hope so," the Tianxi replied, "since we're headed down the same one." The gray-eyed thief paused. "Your odds might be better with them," he finally said. The Tianxi soldier eyed the bottle in his hand. "Somehow I doubt that," he said. "Besides, we struck a bargain." The thief cocked an eyebrow. Neither of them were Mulaney, to be obsessed with honor and oaths. "And their way of going about things leave a bad taste in my mouth," Young admitted. "They are headed to the high road out west for some reason. They want to let the rest of us go first." It only took him a moment to figure it out. "Lupin bait," the thief guessed. "While we're being eaten they'll sneak past the packs." "That is also Marid," Young grunted, "and I've hit too much of that tired old game." Tristan studied him for a long moment, looking at the older man's sweating face. He'd begun drinking already, the thief thought. "One day," he said, "I'd like to know why you left Tianxia." Their eyes met. "No," Young mirthlessly smiled. "You wouldn't." The former soldier flicked a glance at the crew forming around the Infanzones, frowning. "If you have a scheme, now is the time for it," he said. "They are about to leave." For the barest moment, Tristan hesitated. Beatrice was with them. But then he considered the thought of letting the Infanzones get away with it, of letting them walk away clean like they always did, and it burned like coals in his belly. In the end, All that he owed his fellow rat was the ugly law they'd been born to, nothing more and nothing less. Tristan uncorked the green bottle. The transparent fluid inside was sticky yet surprisingly liquid, so he was careful not to spill any as he wiped his right hand. He carefully put the bottle back and closed the cabinet, walking over to where the crowd had gathered for the last of the earlier squabbling. Their eyes Han had angrily thrown the knife the Infanzones lied about, and there it still was. Tristan ripped it clear of the ground with his left hand, careful to slather the leather grip with the liquid. He then strode right into the midst the Infanzone's crew, blade in hand. Song loosely aimed her musket his way, and Tredegar put her hand on her saber, but he went straight for Augusto Cherton and smiled. He flipped the knife, offering the handle to the scowling Infanzone. "You gifted it to your valet, didn't you say?" Tristan said. "Have it back. Perhaps back in your hands it won't earn so poor a reputation." With all those eyes on him, with Ruesta's eyes on him, Augusto could not back down from the implied challenge. He took the knife, fingers closing around the extract-drenched handle. It would have felt humid, but not wet. Not enough to draw suspicion. "That mouth of yours will cost you someday, boy," the Infanzone coldly said. "More than it already has." "We all pay the price at the end, Cherton," Tristan easily replied. "It's the single fair thing in all the world." And with that he walked away from the Infanzone, from the lot of them, and back up the hill as they began to leave. The moment they were out of sight, Tristan rushed to his medicine cabinet. He carefully opened it using only his left hand, unlatching the clasps and reaching for the glass bottle at the bottom. Shoving it under his armpit as he reached for a rag, he pulled the cork and wet the rag with grain alcohol. Methodically, ignoring all the eyes on him, the thief wiped his hand on the edge of his clothes with the wet rag. He was particularly careful with his skin, knowing that lodestar extract would sink in unless dissolved by alcohol. "So what was that about?" Young bluntly asked. Tristan finished up with the rag and tossed it away, careful not step anywhere near it. He then cast a look at the 7 people he'd be taking the trial of lines with, the band of leftovers that no one else had wanted. Young and Sare, the drunk and the woman wearing a mask. The exhausted and bickering married pair of Ains and Felis, the gambler and the dust addict. Grief-stricken Lan who had put him in her debt, her once polished smile replaced by poorly hidden rage. And then the gray hairs, bespectacled Vanessa and ever-coughing Franco with his toothless smile. It was not the crew he'd wanted, but it was the one he had. He must make the most of it. An introduction was in order, a proper one. "Are any of you familiar with lodestone extract?" Tristan asked. He got mostly blank looks, though Lan frowned as if trying to recall something. Most importantly, Francho's eyes lit up. "You coated the knife in it?" the old man asked. "The handle," the thief agreed. The gray hair hummed in understanding. "And for those of us unfamiliar with the substance?" Sare asked. "The lodestone bush is a plant that grows berries," Francho explained, tone gone professorial. "It is common across the west and south of the Trebian Sea. The berries, while comestible, have an unpleasant side effect. Their juice doesn't smell like anything to us," Tristan revealed, "but to lemures, they reek of fresh blood." A moment of silence. Lemures like lupines, the beasts with the noses of hunting hounds crawling around these parts. "The extract," Young slowly said, "it will be more concentrated than the raw berry juice, won't it? At least 100 times, if it is anything like what is sold in Sacramonte markets," old Francho said, grinning a toothless grin. "Clever boy. Every lupin for a dozen miles will be after them like they're the only meat at the feast." The thief only smiled a pleasant, friendly smile. "They meant to use us to clear their path," he shrugged. "I am only returning the favor in kind." Tristan liked to think of himself as a practical man, even when moved by revenge. It did not matter if the deed was not of his own hand, so long as Cosman the Chertons died.